Think of our national parks. What comes to mind? Towering trees, majestic mountains, the quiet serenity of nature. It's the place we go to escape, to find peace. But for the men and women who work there, the forest rangers, these vast wilderness areas hold a different reality. They see what happens when the sun goes down, what lurks just off the marked trails, and what the beautiful landscapes can hide. They are the first on the scene for a missing person report, the ones who follow tracks that lead to nowhere, and the keepers of stories that defy easy explanation. Stories that will make you think twice before you next step into the woods alone. Today we're sharing a collection of true, terrifying stories from park rangers across the country. These aren't campfire tales, they are first-hand accounts of encounters that are strange, unsettling, and will absolutely give you chills. So, turn down the lights and get ready to hear what truly happens in the wild. My name is Dr. Cole Jennings. It's important to state my full name and title, not out of arrogance, but for the sake of the record. When you spend your life in the pursuit of empirical data and hard science, you learn that precision is a form of respect. For the work, for the truth, and for yourself. I am a geothermal geologist, a specialist in subterranean heat sources. For the past decade, I've worked under contract for various geological survey firms and governmental agencies, a life that has taken me from the volcanic fields of Iceland to the geyser basins of New Zealand. I am, by nature and profession, a solitary man. I find the ancient, silent language of rock strata and mineral veins more compelling than most human conversation. The wilderness is not a place I visit. It is my office, my cathedral, and often my only companion. This particular assignment had brought me to Ethelgard National Park, a vast, rugged expanse of protected land in the Pacific Northwest. The park is a geologist's dream, a chaotic tapestry of volcanic rock, ancient forests, and sprawling underground cave systems. My mission, under the banner of the Prometheus Geothermal Project, was to conduct a detailed survey of a newly discovered network of subterranean hot springs. The goal was to assess its potential for clean energy production. It was groundbreaking work, the kind that could define a career. For 3 weeks, I had been operating out of a small, isolated ranger station, venturing daily into the maw of the earth. The entrance to the cave system, known locally as the Veins, was a jagged scar in the side of a moss-covered mountain. Getting there required a 2-hour hike from the station, a journey that served as a perfect transition from the world of sunlight and birdsong to the profound silence of the deep. Each morning, I'd shoulder my pack, heavy with scientific instruments, seismometers, a portable mass spectrometer, water sampling kits, and my trusty data logger, and make my way into the perpetual twilight of the forest, the scent of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. The veins were a complex, multi-level system. The main cavern opened into a series of smaller tunnels, some tight enough to require a shimmy on my belly, others expanding into chambers large enough to hold a house. My work was focused on the lowest accessible level, a network of interconnected grottos where the geothermal activity was most pronounced. Here, crystal clear water, heated by the planet's core, bubbled up into pools of varying sizes. The air was thick with a cloying humidity and the sharp, acrid tang of sulfur, a smell I had long come to associate with progress. For the first 2 weeks, my work was methodical and deeply satisfying. I installed micro-seismometers at key points, took hourly water samples to analyze mineral content and temperature fluctuations, and mapped every fissure and vent. The data was clean, consistent. The earth beneath Ethelgard was alive with thermal energy, a stable and powerful system. I felt a sense of ownership, of intimate understanding. I knew the gurgle of each spring, the unique mineral deposits that gave each pool its subtle shade of turquoise or emerald. In my logbook, I referred to the largest chamber as the Hurt Chamber, a grotto where 3 large springs converged. It was the epicenter of the network's power and the focus of my survey. The first anomaly occurred on the morning of my 16th day. It was subtle, so subtle I almost dismissed it. As I was calibrating a seismometer near the edge of the central pool in the heart chamber, I registered a faint low frequency tremor. This was not unusual in a geothermally active zone, but this was different. The tremors I was used to were erratic, chaotic bursts of energy. This was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 thump. It was almost perfectly metronomic, with a frequency of approximately 50 beats per minute. A resting heart rate. I checked my equipment, assuming a malfunction. I rebooted the sensor, ran diagnostics, and even swapped it with a backup unit. The reading remained the same. A slow, rhythmic pulse emanating from deep within the rock. I noted it in my logbook with a clinical detachment. Anomalous rhythmic seismic activity detected. Frequency stable. Source unknown. Further monitoring required. Science is about observing, not concluding. I had no explanation, so I would simply gather more data. Over the next 2 days, the pulse continued, unwavering. It became a background noise to my work, a constant, low thrum I could feel more than hear. It was a deep vibration that seemed to resonate in the bones of my skull and the soles of my boots. I tried to find a geological parallel. Perhaps a regularly collapsing gas pocket or a unique form of water hammer effect in a deep, undiscovered conduit. But no theory fit the perfect biological rhythm of the phenomenon. The thought, absurd and unscientific, flickered in my mind. It sounds like it's sleeping. On the 18th day, the pulse grew stronger. The thrumming was no longer a subtle vibration. It was a palpable force. The surface of the water in the hot springs began to tremble in time with it, creating concentric ripples that spread out from the center of the pools with each beat. It was mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. My scientific curiosity was rapidly being eroded by a more primal emotion, unease. The silence of the cave was gone, replaced by this incessant, organic rhythm. The heart chamber now felt less like a geological formation and more like the inside of some colossal, living creature. I was packing my gear for the day, my headlamp beam cutting a nervous swath through the darkness, when the second event occurred. It began in the largest of the 3 pools, the one I had designated Alpha Spring. A wisp of color, like a single drop of red ink in a glass of water, uncoiled from the deepest part of the spring. It was not the rusty brown of iron oxide or any other mineral I recognized. It was a vivid, shocking crimson. I froze, my hand hovering over my backpack. I watched, transfixed, as more tendrils of red blood into the crystal clear water. They twisted and coiled, dancing in slow motion to the rhythm of the pulsing earth. Within a minute, the entire pool was no longer clear. It had turned the color of freshly spilled blood. The transformation was silent, graceful, and utterly horrifying. Then, the other 2 springs in the chamber began to change. The same sickly crimson tendrils rose from their depths, spreading through the water like a contagion. The acrid smell of sulfur was being overpowered by a new scent, a coppery, metallic odor that I knew instinctively. It was the smell of blood. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic counter, rhythm to the slow, steady beat of the earth. I stared at the 3 pools, now glowing a ghastly, sanguinary red in the beam of my headlamp. The water, the lifeblood of this geothermal system, had become literal blood. The scientific part of my brain was screaming, scrambling for an explanation. A sudden release of a unique microbial colony, an undiscovered chemical reaction. But the other part of my brain, the ancient, animal part that understands fear, knew what I was seeing. This was not geology. This was a message. The ground beneath my feet gave a particularly strong pulse, a deep, resonant TMP that felt like a sigh. It was no longer sleeping. It was waking up, and it knew I was there. I snatched my backpack, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and scrambled away from the blood-red water, my mind a vortex of terror. The only thought that remained was to get out, to get back to the sun, to the world that made sense. But as I stumbled back into the narrow tunnels, the rhythmic pulse seemed to follow me, resonating through the rock, a monstrous heartbeat chasing me through the veins of the earth. Panic is a poor substitute for reason, a lesson I had learned intellectually, but was now experiencing with every cell in my body. My retreat from the heart chamber was not a strategic withdrawal. It was a desperate, clumsy flight. The rhythmic thump thump of the earth was no longer just an auditory or seismic phenomenon. It was the conductor of my terror, a monstrous metronome setting the pace for my pounding heart. It resonated through the rock, up through the soles of my boots, and into my skeleton. I felt it in my teeth. The sound was inside me now, a parasitic beat supplanted my own. The air, thick with the coppery tang of blood, choked me, and the beam from my headlamp seemed to bounce frantically off the wet cavern walls, painting streaks of light that looked like terrified ghosts. I scrambled back through the passages I had so meticulously mapped, but my mental chart was useless. In my terror, familiar turns became alien, and passages I'd navigated with ease now seemed constricted and hostile. The very texture of the rock had changed. Where it had once been rough and dry, offering reliable handholds, it now felt slick and strangely pliant. On more than one occasion, my palm slid against a surface that felt less like stone and more like damp, cool flesh. I snatched my hand back each time, a jolt of revulsion coursing through me. I tried to rationalize it, a new mineral secretion, a film of algae reacting to the change in water chemistry. But my scientific mind was being shouted down by a primal instinct that screamed wrong, wrong, wrong. The tunnels twisted in on themselves. I was certain I was heading towards the main cavern that led to the surface, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper, into narrower, more suffocating darkness. The heartbeat of the cave grew louder, more insistent. THMP, THUMP, TMP, CHUMP. It was a possessive territorial sound. It wasn't just chasing me. It was speaking a language of absolute power, and I was an insignificant microbe caught in its circulatory system. My light flickered. I tapped the side of the headlamp, a frantic motion. The beam steadied, but for a horrifying second, I had been plunged into absolute blackness, a darkness so profound it felt solid. In that moment of blindness, the pulsing was all that existed. I was floating in a sea of rhythmic dread. I pushed forward, my breath coming in ragged sobs. I had to believe I was making progress, that the exit was just around the next bend. That's when I felt the draft, a cool, faint current of air against my sweat-soaked cheek. Hope, sharp and brilliant, pierced through my panic. It was fresh air. It had to be. It didn't carry the sulfurous or metallic scent of the deep chambers. It smelled of damp earth, of night, of freedom. Renewed, I pushed towards the source of the draft, scrambling on hands and knees through a low, narrow fissure I didn't recognize from my maps. The pulsing seemed to recede slightly, or perhaps my focus on the promise of escape was simply drowning it out. The fissure opened up into another chamber, larger than I anticipated. I stood up, sweeping my headlamp across the space, and my hope curdled into ice. This was not a chamber I had ever seen before. It was not on any of my maps. The walls were different, smoother, and they curved upwards into a dome, like ceiling that was lost in the shadows above my beam. And the source of the draft was not an exit. In the center of the chamber stood a pillar of rock, but it wasn't rock. It looked organic, like a column of petrified muscle, and it was riddled with thousands of small holes, like a monstrous sea sponge. It was from these pores that the fresh air was being exhaled and inhaled in time with the great heartbeat of the earth. I was not feeling a draft from the outside world. I was standing before a lung. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. My carefully constructed understanding of the world, of geology, of the very laws of nature, was shattering. This was not a cave system. I was inside a living organism of incomprehensible scale. The geothermal network was its circulatory system, the chamber of blood, red pools its heart, and this was how it breathed. As my light scanned the base of the colossal lung, it caught on something metallic. Half buried in the fleshy, looking rock of the floor was a piece of equipment. It was an older model of a portable seismometer, corroded and ancient looking, caked in mineral deposits that seemed to have been deliberately secreted over it. A few feet away lay a rock hammer, its wooden handle rotted away, the head fused to the floor, and next to it, the most chilling discovery of all, a boot. A sturdy, old-fashioned hiking boot, not unlike my own. It was empty, but the rock floor had grown up and around it, gripping it, absorbing it, as if trying to digest it. I wasn't the first. The Prometheus Project wasn't the first attempt to understand this place. Someone else had been here, decades ago perhaps. Another geologist, another solitary professional drawn by the allure of scientific discovery. What had happened to them? The answer was all around me. They hadn't escaped. They hadn't reported their findings. They had been consumed. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, different from the pulsing heartbeat. It was a wet, tearing noise. I spun around, my light darting wildly. One of the passages leading into the chamber, the one I had just crawled through, was closing. The rock walls were constricting, the opening shrinking with a slow, deliberate peristalsis. It was sealing me in. My escape route was being pinched shut by living stone. Terror gave way to a chilling, absolute certainty. I was no longer just lost. I was being processed. The initial anomalies, the pulse, the blood-red water, were not a warning. They were a response. They were the initial stages of a digestive process, and I was the foreign body that had triggered it. The creature had been dormant, and I had awakened it. Now it was adapting its own anatomy to contain and dissolve me. My gaze fell back on the half-absorbed boot. I imagined the person who wore it, their final moments in this breathing, bleeding, living tomb. Did they scream? Did they fight? Or did they, like me, simply stare and utter soul-crushing disbelief as the ground itself turned against them? The great heart of the earth continued its slow, inexorable beat, and for the first time, I understood it wasn't a sound of anger or aggression. It was the calm, steady, and eternal rhythm of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. And it has all the time in the world. Time loses all meaning in the belly of the beast. My watch was still functioning, its digital face a defiant little rectangle of order in a world of biological chaos. But the passage of hours felt irrelevant. Was it one day?
Two, I don't know.
The only clock that mattered was the slow, steady heartbeat of the earth and the slow, steady constriction of the passage that was once my only way out. I watched, mesmerized by the grotesque spectacle. As the fissure shrank from a crawl space to a seam, the two sides of living rock meeting with a wet, final sigh. The draft of cool air was gone. I was sealed in. The lung chamber was now my tomb. The initial, blinding wave of terror receded, leaving behind something colder and heavier: resignation. I am a scientist. My life has been a disciplined quest for knowledge in the face of the unknown. And this, I realized with a clarity that was itself a form of madness, was the ultimate unknown. I was not going to be rescued. My name, Dr. Cole Jennings, would eventually be added to the sad, long list of people the wilderness has swallowed. But I had a few hours of battery left in my headlamp, my data logger. I would not die screaming. I would die observing. It was the only defiance I had left. My final experiment would be the documentation of my own dissolution. Log entry. I began, my voice a dry rasp. I held the small digital recorder close. Subject: Cole Jennings. Location: indeterminate chamber within the organism. The primary exit has been sealed. I am contained. The great lung-like structure in the center of the chamber continued its rhythmic breathing. Inhale. Exhale. I approached it cautiously, my fear now tempered with a morbid scientific curiosity. The surface wasn't rock. It was a complex organic tissue, cool to the touch and slightly yielding, like dense cartilage. The pores that dotted its surface dilated and contracted with each breath. I held my water sampling syringe near one of the larger pores as it exhaled. The gas that emerged was not air as we know it. My portable spectrometer identified high concentrations of methane, argon, and several complex hydrocarbons I couldn't identify. This creature did not breathe oxygen. It breathed the deep, primordial gases of the planet itself. The floor beneath my feet was changing. The fleshy stone was becoming softer, and a clear, viscous fluid began to seep from it, pooling in shallow depressions. I knelt, my rational mind taking over, and collected a sample. The liquid was warm. My chemical analysis kit revealed it to be a complex enzymatic cocktail, a horrifyingly efficient mix of proteases and lipases. It was a digestive fluid. The chamber wasn't just a lung, it was a stomach. And the process had begun. The first thing to go was my boots. The thick leather, which had protected me from rocks and streams, began to darken and soften where it sat in the shallow pools of enzyme. Within an hour, they were the consistency of wet cardboard, the seams dissolving. I felt the fluid seep into my socks, warm and invasive against my skin. There was no pain, just a strange tingling sensation, a pins and needles feeling as my nerve endings were gently, methodically being silenced. The great heartbeat continued. THEMP, TMP, TMP, THEMP. But now, it seemed to be accompanied by something else. A low hum, a resonance that vibrated not in the rock, but in my mind. It felt like a voice, but without words. It was a cascade of pure information, of raw consciousness. Images, feelings, and concepts flooded my brain unbidden. I saw visions of a world without sun, a planet of molten rock and silent, patient life. I felt a consciousness that measured time not in days or years, but in geological epochs. It had lain dormant for millennia, a silent god beneath the mountains, feeding on geothermal energy, its lifeblood the heat of the world's core. I saw other intrusions, not just the geologist whose boot was now a permanent part of the floor. I saw animals that had wandered too deep. I saw native tribesmen from centuries past, their forms dissolving into the creature's mass. It learned from what it consumed, absorbing not just nutrients, but memories, experiences. The Prometheus Project hadn't discovered a new power source. We had stumbled upon an ancient intelligence. The entity is telepathic. I whispered into my recorder, my own voice sounding alien. It communicates through direct neural interface. It is not malicious. It does not hate. It simply incorporates. Its existence is a cycle of dormancy, awakening, and absorption. My equipment pack was next. The durable canvas softened and fell apart, spilling my life's work onto the digesting floor. Seismometers, rock samples, my logbook, all were slowly being rendered down to their constituent molecules. I watched my mass spectrometer, a miracle of human engineering, vanish into the glistening ooze. My headlamp began to flicker as the enzymes worked on its plastic casing. Soon, I would be in darkness. The tingling in my feet had spread to my legs. I looked down. My trousers had dissolved, and my skin was no longer my own. It was becoming translucent, and I could see the rock, flesh of the floor beginning to merge with it. I was being fused to the planet. The line between Cole Jennings and the living earth was blurring. The final log entry. My hands were shaking, the skin of my fingers thinning and dissolving. I held the recorder, my last link to the world I had known. This is Dr. Cole Jennings signing off. My conclusion is this: we are not the masters of this world. We are merely a transient infestation on the skin of a much older, much larger form of life. We drill and we dig, but we have never truly understood what lies beneath. We have been living on a sleeping giant. I let the recorder fall. It landed with a soft, wet plop. The beam of my headlamp, my last piece of the sun, sputtered and died, plunging me into the absolute, living dark. But I was not alone. The heartbeat was all around me, inside me. THUMP, THUMP. My own heart was struggling to match its rhythm, to synchronize with the pulse of the world. The visions intensified. I felt my memories being drawn out of me, my childhood, my studies, my lonely years in the wilderness. All of it being siphoned away, becoming another drop of data in an ocean of ancient consciousness. My body was gone. My name was gone. My mind was the last thing to dissolve. The I that was Cole Jennings was unraveling, my thoughts becoming part of the slow, planetary thoughts of the creature. And in the last flicker of my own consciousness, I felt a final, horrifying emotion that was not my own. It was the creature's. And it was not anger, or hunger, or malice. It was a profound and eternal loneliness. And then there was only the beat. My name is Sterling, and for the better part of 15 years, I've had the privilege of serving as a park ranger within the sprawling, ancient heart of the Appalachian Mountains. It's not merely a job for me, it's a calling, a deep-seated connection to the land that my family has inhabited for generations. My official title is Lid Ranger, which comes with a host of responsibilities, from managing patrol schedules and coordinating with wildlife services to ensuring the safety and, theoretically, the peace of mind of every soul that ventures into our jurisdiction. I've I've seen my share of emergencies, lost hikers, sudden rock slides, aggressive bears, and the aftermath of lightning strike fires. I'm trained in wilderness first aid, search and rescue protocols, and firearm use. I am, by all professional standards, prepared for the tangible dangers this forest can present. Nothing, however, could have prepared me for what I saw on that unnervingly quiet Thursday in late October. The park itself is a mosaic of old, growth timber, dense rhododendron thickets we call hells, and high, lonely balds that offer views stretching across 3 states. It's a place of profound, almost intimidating beauty. The trees here are titans, centuries-old hemlocks and oaks that filter the sunlight into a dim, cathedral-like glow on the forest floor. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and pine. There's a weight to the silence in the deeper woods, a sense of presence that goes beyond just wildlife. The Cherokee who first walked these paths had names for the spirits of these mountains, stories of things that moved in the shadows, things best left undisturbed. In our modern rational world, we dismiss these as folklore, charming tales to tell around a campfire. I used to be one of those people. That Thursday began like any other. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the first real bite of impending winter. The tourist season was winding down, leaving only the hardcore campers and a few locals enjoying the last vestiges of fall color. My patrol assignment was the main campground loop, designated Ridgeback Camp. It's one of our most popular sites, nestled in a valley by a clear, fast-running creek. My duties were routine check permits, remind campers about food storage protocols to keep the bears uninterested, ensure campfires were properly contained, and generally serve as the friendly, uniformed face of the National Park Service. I spent the morning chatting with a family from Ohio, helping them identify a bird they'd seen, and sternly warning a couple of college kids about the foolishness of leaving their cooler out in the open. The day was placid. The campers were respectful, the weather was perfect, and the forest seemed to be in a state of tranquil slumber. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, a subtle wrongness began to creep into the edges of my perception. It started with the silence. Usually, the woods are a symphony of sound, the chatter of squirrels, the call of blue jays, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. But that afternoon, a hush had fallen. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a storm. The squirrels had vanished. The birds were gone. I remember standing by my truck listening. The only sounds were the distant gurgle of the creek and the sighing of the wind through the high branches. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I've spent enough time in the wild to trust my instincts, and they were screaming that something was out of place. I mentioned it to Dale, another ranger, over the radio during a routine check-in. Feels weirdly quiet up at Ridgeback. Dale, you notice anything on your end? His voice crackled back, tinged with his usual laid-back amusement. Just the wind stirling. Maybe the critters know something we don't. Big cold front coming, probably. I tried to accept his logic. It was plausible. Animals are sensitive to barometric pressure changes. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a primal sensation, the kind that raises the hair on your arms and makes you want to put your back against a tree. I found myself scanning the dense tree line that bordered the campground, my eyes searching the deep shadows between the ancient trunks. I saw nothing, but the feeling persisted, a constant, invisible pressure. Later, while making my final rounds as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, I found something that solidified my anxiety. Near the edge of an unoccupied campsite at the far end of the loop, I saw a set of tracks in the soft earth. They were faint, but undeniable. At first glance, they looked like deer tracks. We have an abundance of white-tailed deer, so that was hardly unusual. But I knelt for a closer look, my professional curiosity piqued. The prints were wrong. A deer's hoof is a clean, heart-shaped cloven print. These were vaguely similar in shape, but seemed sharper, more elongated. And the stride was off. The distance between the prints was too long, unnaturally so, suggesting limbs of an impossible length for any deer I'd ever seen. Furthermore, there was a drag mark, a faint line scratched in the dirt behind one of the prints, as if a toe had caught. Deer don't have toes that drag. I followed the tracks for a few yards until they disappeared onto the hard, leaf-strewn ground leading into the forest. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, washed over me. I've cataloged tracks for everything from black bears to bobcats. I'd never seen anything like this. I tried to push it from my mind, attributing it to a deformed animal or a trick of the light. But the image of those tracks stayed with me as I finished my patrol. The sun had dipped below the western ridge, and the world was plunged into the gloaming. The campground was settling down for the night. Campfires crackled, casting dancing shadows, and the low murmur of conversations drifted through the air. The oppressive silence from earlier had been replaced by the sounds of humanity. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. The feeling of being watched had intensified, now focused, as if a predator had singled out its prey. I was heading back to my truck, parked near the campground entrance, ready to call it a night. That's when I saw it. On the opposite side of the loop, standing just inside the impenetrable darkness of the tree line, was what my brain initially registered as a deer. It was about 70 yards away, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive oak. It was its stillness that first caught my attention. It was absolutely motionless, like a statue. My hand went to the powerful flashlight on my belt, and I swept the beam across the distance, illuminating the figure. And my blood ran cold. My heart didn't just pound, it felt like it seized in my chest. This was not a deer. Its body was thin, emaciated, the color of old, weathered bark. But it was the legs that defied all reason. They were impossibly long and slender, bent at angles that seemed both backward and forward at the same time, like the legs of a spider fused onto the torso of a mammal. They lifted its body far too high off the ground. Its neck was also grotesquely elongated, snaking upwards into the gloom, and at its end was a narrow, deer-like head. But there were no gentle, brown eyes. In the beam of my flashlight, its eyes reflected back not with the typical green or yellow of an animal, but with a flat, intelligent, milky white. Then it moved. It wasn't the graceful, fluid movement of a deer. It took a slow, deliberate step out from behind the tree, its gait stilted and horrifyingly human-like. It was a jointed, marionette-like motion, a terrible parody of walking. It lifted one of its forelegs, the joint bending with a sickening, unnatural smoothness, and placed it silently on the ground. It turned its head, and I heard, or perhaps felt, a faint, dry crackle like old bones rubbing together. It wasn't looking at the campers. Its blank, white eyes were fixed directly on me. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the campground faded into a dull roar in my ears. There was only me, the beam of my flashlight cutting a tunnel through the darkness, and the impossible thing standing at its end, silently observing me with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The moment I've heard other first responders talk about, that instant of cold, clear realization that you are in over your head, was a laughable understatement. This was a plunge into a reality I never knew existed, and in the chilling silence of that Appalachian dusk, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that should not be, something that the old Cherokee tales had tried to warn us about. For a stretch of time that I cannot measure, my universe contracted to the 70 yards of space between me and the creature. The beam of my flashlight was a physical tether, and I was terrified that if I broke the connection, it would either vanish or charge. Every ounce of my training, every emergency protocol I had ever memorized, evaporated into a cold, useless vapor. My mind was a roaring vacuum, unable to categorize what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't a bear with mange or a deer with some horrific birth defect. This was a violation of natural law, standing casually at the edge of a family campground. The silence it had brought to the forest earlier now seemed to emanate from it, a tangible aura of profound and ancient stillness. The thing's milky, white eyes did not blink. They were fixed on mine with an unnerving placidity, an expression of detached, analytical curiosity. There was no aggression in its posture, no bared teeth or threatening growl. There was only the silent, unblinking stare, and that was infinitely more terrifying. It was the look of a being so far removed from the natural order that concepts like aggression were beneath it. I was not prey. I was a point of interest. A puzzle it was calmly considering. My hand, slick with sweat, trembled on the grip of the flashlight. My other hand instinctively moved, not towards the firearm on my hip, but to the radio on my shoulder. What would I say? Dispatch, I have a visual on a folkloric entity. I could already hear the bewildered silence, followed by questions about my sobriety. My professionalism, my very sanity would be shattered. Yet, the alternative was to stand there and do nothing while this thing held court at the edge of my patrol area. Then it tilted its head. The motion was accompanied by that same hideous, dry crackle of bone on bone. It was a slow, inquisitive gesture. And as it did something that broke the spell of my paralysis and plunged me into a new depth of horror. It opened its mouth. A deer's mouth is small, designed for grazing. This thing's jaw unhinged, dropping far too low, splitting its narrow face in a way that was grotesquely human. And from that impossible maw, a sound emerged. It was a soft, wet, clicking sound. A mimic sound. It was the sound of the family from Ohio I had spoken to earlier, the father trying to coax a chipmunk closer for his young daughter to see. Tesk. The creature reproduced it perfectly, but the sound was hollow, devoid of life, like a recording played on a broken speaker. It had been close enough to hear them. It had been watching. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a chance encounter. It had been observing the campers, studying them, learning. That mimicry was the catalyst. It snapped my brain out of its stunned inertia and into a state of cold, adrenalized focus. This creature was not just a passive anomaly, it was an intelligent, observant, and potentially manipulative entity. The safety of the campers became the only thought in my mind. Panic was not an option. Firing my weapon was out of the question. It would create a stampede of terrified people running blindly into a forest that contained this. I had to de-escalate. I had to get it to leave. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I lowered the beam of the flashlight from its face to the ground in front of it. It was a gesture of non-aggression, something we were taught to do with cornered animals. Easy now, I said, my voice a strained whisper. The sound of my own voice seemed like a sacrilege in the profound silence. Just move on. There's nothing for you here. The creature stopped its clicking. Its head straightened with another dry crackle. For a long moment, it remained still, its white eyes now reflecting the diffused light from the ground. Then, it took a step backward. The motion was just as stilted and unnatural as before, a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. It took another step, its impossibly long limbs folding and unfolding as it retreated into the oppressive darkness under the trees. It didn't turn its back on me. It faced me the entire time, its gaze never leaving mine, until it was swallowed by the shadows. One moment it was there, a solid shape of wrongness, and the next, it was simply gone. The void it left behind felt more menacing than its presence had. I stood there for a full minute, my lungs burning, only then realizing I had been holding my breath. The sounds of the campground rushed back in. The laughter, the crackle of fires, the faint strum of a guitar. It was all so normal, so mundane, that it felt like a dream. Had I imagined it? Was my mind, under the strain of the unusual quiet, simply playing tricks on me? But my body knew better. The tremor in my hands was real. The cold sweat soaking the back of my uniform was real. And the lingering image of those milky, white eyes was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. My first coherent thought was protocol. Secure the area. Warn the others. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers clumsy. Dale, you still there? His voice, a beacon of normalcy, crackled back almost immediately. Still here, Sterling. Heading home soon. What's up? I struggled for the right words, the right balance of urgency and professional calm. Dale, I want you to do me a favor. Swing by the access road to Ridgeback and close the gate. I'm calling the campground full for the night. No one else in or out. There was a pause. Full. Sterling, I checked the logs an hour ago. You've got at least half a dozen empty sites. I know. Just do it. I've got a potential wildlife issue here. A possibly rabid animal. I don't want anyone else coming in until I've assessed it. It was the best lie I could come up with, flimsy and inadequate, but it was all I had. A rabid coyote or fox was something he could understand. Rabid. Did it try to attack someone? The amusement was gone from his voice, replaced by professional concern. Negative. Just highly unusual and aggressive posturing. I'm handling it, but I want the area contained as a precaution. Please, just lock the gate. All right, Sterling. On my way. Keep your head on a swivel. You want me to come up there? No, I said, perhaps too quickly.
No, I'm fine.
I just need to observe it, see where it goes. I'll check in again in 30. Copy that. Gates closing. Be safe. Ending the transmission, I felt a profound sense of isolation. I had lied, erecting a wall between myself and the only person who could offer immediate help. But I had to. How could I protect anyone if they thought I was crazy? My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to walk across the campground loop towards the spot where the creature had stood. I kept my flashlight beam low, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible, just a ranger on his final rounds. The campers, cocooned in their little islands of firelight and canvas, paid me no mind. They were blissfully unaware of the abyss that had just stared back at them from the tree line. I found the spot easily. The ground was soft here, damp from the nearby creek, and there, pressed into the dark earth, were the tracks. The same elongated, sharp, unnatural prints I had found earlier, but these were clearer, deeper. And alongside them, I saw something else. I saw the distinct, 5-fingered print of a hand. It wasn't a bear's paw print with its broad pads and claw marks. It was unmistakably a handprint, but skeletal and long, with fingers like desiccated twigs. It had steadied itself on the ground as it stepped back. I followed the tracks to the edge of the forest. The feeling of being watched returned, 10 times stronger than before. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of milky white eyes. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a presence, a living entity that had just shown me one of its inhabitants. My training screamed at me not to enter the woods after a potentially dangerous animal at night. My gut screamed that what was in those woods was not an animal at all. I was about to turn back, to retreat to the cold, metal safety of my truck and wait for the sun, when my flashlight beam caught something. A small splash of color against the brown and gray of the forest floor, just a few feet from where the last visible track disappeared. I moved closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lying half, buried in the damp leaves, was a small, plastic barrette, shaped like a bright yellow butterfly. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to the little girl from the Ohio family, the one whose father had been making clicking sounds to attract a chipmunk. I had seen it in her hair that morning. And it was here, in the exact spot where an impossible creature had stood and mimicked that very sound. It hadn't just been watching. It had been close. Unspeakably close. Picking up the yellow butterfly barrette was like picking up a live coal. It seemed to pulse with a cold energy, a tangible link to the monstrous thing that had left it there. My mind raced, stumbling over the implications. This wasn't a random dropping. It was a message. A deliberate, calculated gesture. The creature hadn't just been close to the little girl, it had taken something from her and then deposited it here, on the trail of its own unnatural tracks, for me to find. It was a display of capability. It was a threat. I was this close. I can be this close whenever I want. The safety of that little girl became an all-consuming fire in my gut. Protocol, professional reputation, the fear of ridicule. It all burned away, leaving only a singular, desperate purpose. I had to get to her. I had to see with my own eyes that she was safe. I turned from the ominous black wall of the forest and sprinted. My boots pounded on the asphalt loop of the campground, a frantic rhythm against the placid backdrop of crackling fires and quiet conversations. A few campers looked up, their faces surprised to see a ranger moving with such undisguised panic. I didn't care. I didn't slow down. My flashlight beam cut a frantic, bouncing path ahead of me. sweeping past tents and trailers until I found the campsite I was looking for. It was number 17, the family from Ohio. Their large tent was zipped shut, a warm, reassuring light glowing from within. The fire was burning low, and 2 camp chairs sat empty beside it. For a heart-stopping second, I feared the tent was empty, that I was too late. I called out, my voice tight and hoarse. "Hello, MPS Ranger. Is everyone all right in there?" The zipper tore open, and the father's face appeared, etched with worry. "Ranger, is something wrong?" "Sir, your daughter," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Is she with you? Is she okay?" His confusion deepened into alarm. "Yes, she's right here. She's asleep." What's happened?" He stepped aside, and I peered into the tent. There, nestled in a small sleeping bag, was the little girl, her breathing soft and even. Her mother was beside her, looking up at me with wide, frightened eyes. The relief that washed over me was so profound it almost buckled my knees. She was safe, for now. I held up the yellow beret. "Sir, I found this at the edge of the woods. I believe it belongs to your daughter." He looked at the small piece of plastic in my palm, and the color drained from his face. Her butterfly clip, she was heartbroken she'd lost it. We looked all over for it after dinner. "Where did you say you found it?" I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't say, "I found it next to the skeletal handprint of a monster that was mimicking your voice." Instead, I lied again, the words tasting like ash. "Just down the path. Must have dropped off when you were walking earlier." The father nodded, but his eyes were filled with a new, dawning dread. "Ranger," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he stepped out of the tent, zipping it quietly behind him. "About an hour ago, my wife and I heard something. Just outside the tent. It sounded like scratching and clicking. My blood went cold."
Clicking?
"Yes, like the sound I was making for the chipmunks this afternoon. It was soft, but it was right there," he said, pointing to a spot on the ground no more than 2 feet from the tent wall. I thought it was a raccoon, so I yelled, and it stopped, but it didn't sound like it ran away. It just went quiet. My professional FAS aide was cracking. He saw the look on my face, and his fear solidified. "What's going on, Ranger? What kind of animal is out there?" I made a decision. It was a career-ending, protocol-shattering decision, but it was the only one I could make. "Sir, I need you to do exactly as I say. I need you to wake your wife and daughter as quietly as you can. Pack only what you absolutely need. Your wallets, your keys, your phones. Leave everything else. Get in your vehicle, and I will escort you out of the campground. Do not make any loud noises, and do not use a flashlight. Leave." "But all our gear..." "Your gear isn't important," I said, my voice low and intense. "I'm evacuating this campground. There is a geological instability issue. A potential for a landslide on the main ridge. It's a remote possibility, but I'm not authorized to take any chances. I need you to be the first to leave." Quietly. He saw the lie, but he also saw the stark terror in my eyes, the terror I was no longer trying to hide. He knew this wasn't about a landslide. He nodded, his face grim. "Okay, we'll be ready in 5 minutes." As he slipped back into the tent, I keyed my radio. My voice was calm now, filled with a false, authoritative certainty. "Dale, this is Sterling." "Go ahead, Sterling. Everything okay?" "Negative. I've discovered evidence of a significant fissure along the upper slope of Ridgeback. I'm calling a mandatory evacuation of the entire campground, effective immediately. I need you to call dispatch and report a potential landslide risk. We need to get everyone out of here now." There was a stunned silence. "A landslide? Sterling, there hasn't been a geological survey alert in years. Are you sure?" "I am looking at a crack big enough to swallow a car, Dale. We are not taking chances. Get on the horn. I'm starting the evacuation on my end. I want this place empty in 1 hour." "Okay." "Copy that, Sterling?" "I'm on it. For the next hour, I was no longer a man terrified of a monster. I was a lid ranger in an emergency. I moved from campsite to campsite, my voice firm, my instructions clear. I used the landslide lie, a story of imminent danger that was both believable and non-negotiable. I was met with grumbling, with questions, with frustration, but no one argued with the steely command in my voice. People packed in a hurried, nervous silence, the glow of their headlamps and lanterns cutting through the darkness as they collapsed tents and loaded coolers. The family from Ohio was the first to pull out, their minivan rolling silently towards the gate. The father gave me a long, searching look as he passed, a look of shared, unspoken knowledge. He knew. As the campground emptied, the natural quiet of the woods began to reclaim the space, but it was different now. It was a hungry silence. With every vehicle that left, my sense of isolation grew. The protective bubble of human noise and activity was shrinking, and the ancient, watching presence of the forest was pressing in. Finally, there was only one car left, mine. Dale had arrived to help with the final sweep, his face a mask of professional concern. "I've never seen anything like it. Sterling," he said, shaking his head as he looked at the empty campsites. "You really think this ridge is going to go?" "I'm not risking a single life on the chance that it won't," I said, the lie feeling heavy in my mouth. We stood by my truck, the campground now completely dark save for our headlights. The evacuation was complete. My duty was done. But I knew this wasn't over. The creature was still out there. And then I heard it. From the deep, impenetrable blackness of the tree line, a voice whispered my name, Sterling. It wasn't a mimic. It was a perfect recreation of my own voice, as if a recording of me had been played from the woods. Dale froze, his head snapping towards the sound. "What was that?" "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, it spoke again, this time in Dale's voice. "Be safe." It was a perfect echo of his last words to me over the radio. Dale's face went white in the wash of the headlights. That was me. We both stared into the darkness, paralyzed by a new, more personal level of terror. This thing wasn't just a mimic, it was a thief. It stole sounds, voices, and fears, and it wielded them like weapons. I grabbed Dale by the arm. "We're leaving. Now." We scrambled into my truck, and I threw it into gear, spinning the tires on the gravel as I sped towards the gate. I didn't look back, but I could feel those milky, white eyes on us the entire way. I never filed a report on what I really saw that night. The official record states that Ranger Sterling initiated a precautionary evacuation due to a suspected geological risk that, upon further inspection, was deemed non-threatening. I took the reprimand for the procedural error and the massive expense of the false alarm. It was a small price to pay. I still work here. This is my home. But I am a changed man. I don't look at the forest as a place of simple beauty anymore. I see it as a veil. I know what lies behind it. I know that the old stories are not just tales. They are warnings. Every time I'm on patrol, especially as dusk falls, I feel it. The silence, the feeling of being watched. And I find myself scanning the tree line, my hand resting on the grip of my flashlight, wondering if tonight is the night I'll see that stilted, human-like gait again, and those two blank, milky, white eyes, calmly considering me from the ancient darkness. My name is Blair Thompson, and for the past 6 years, I have served as a park ranger with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. My duties are varied, ranging from trail maintenance and wildlife management to public safety and education. It is a profession that demands a level head, a deep respect for nature, and an unwavering commitment to the rules that keep our wild spaces safe for everyone. For the last 2 years, my post has been here at Calder's Peak National Park, a sprawling expanse of pine, choked mountains, and granite cliffs. At its heart lies Lake Apogee, the jewel of the park and, increasingly, the source of my deepest anxieties. Lake Apogee is not like other bodies of water. It's a man-made reservoir created in the late 1950s by flooding a valley that contained the small, now submerged town of Silver Creek Bend. The official park brochures describe it as a pristine example of engineered beauty, a haven for boaters and anglers. They speak of its staggering depth and its unusually cold, clear water fed by mountain snowmelt. What they don't mention, what you only learn from the hushed conversations in the nearby town of Havenwood, or from the unsettling quiet that sometimes falls over the lake, is its reputation. They call it the Whispering Lake, or more grimly, the collector. It has a history steeped in tragedy, a list of drownings and boating accidents that feels disproportionately long for its size. Locals will tell you the water is cursed, that the spirits of those who died in the valley before the flood, and those the lake has claimed since, remain trapped beneath the surface. It's the kind of folk horror story that clings to a place like morning mist, easy to dismiss in the bright light of day, but harder to ignore when you're the one patrolling its shores, as twilight bleeds across the sky. My station is a small, functional cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the primary boat launch. From my window, I have a panoramic view of the docks, the parking lot, and the vast, often unnervingly placid expanse of the lake itself. My day-to-day work is mostly routine checking permits, ensuring boaters have the required safety equipment, and answering the usual questions about fishing spots and hiking trails. I've always been a practical person, grounded in facts and regulations. I've heard the stories, of course. I've listened patiently to old-timers talk about seeing faces in the water or hearing voices, carried on the wind when no one else is around. I've always chalked it up to local color, the kind of legends that give a place character. I never gave them any real credence. Until last Tuesday, the day started like any other August Tuesday, hot, still, and hazy. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Boaters, mostly weekenders and tourists, trying to squeeze the last drops out of summer, were lining up at the launch ramp. I was in my element, moving from truck to truck with my clipboard, my uniform crisp, my demeanor professional and courteous. Morning, folks. Ranger Thompson. Can I see your permit and safety gear, please? I'd say, over and over. The process was a familiar rhythm, a flash of a laminated card, a quick count of life vests, a check for a fire extinguisher. Most interactions were pleasant. Families excited for a day on the water, fishermen eager to cast their lines. Around 1100 a.m., a sleek, dark blue ski boat pulled up, towed by a polished new pickup truck. The man behind the wheel was in his late 30s, with a confident, easy-going smile and expensive sunglasses. A woman who I presumed was his wife sat in the passenger seat, and two young children were buzzing with energy in the back. They were the picture of a perfect summer outing. Everything in order, Ranger. The man, a Mr. Evans, according to his permit, asked as I finished my inspection. Looks good, sir. I replied, handing back his paperwork. Just a reminder, the Northern Cove is marked off limits due to submerged hazards. And be mindful of the sudden depth changes. This lake can be deceptive. He gave a slight laugh. Heard the stories. Don't worry, we'll stick to the main channel. Just out for some tubing with the kids. I nodded and stepped back, watching as he expertly backed the boat into the water. They were out on the lake within minutes, their laughter echoing back towards the shore before being swallowed by the immense silence of the landscape. The day wore on. The sun beat down, turning the surface of the lake into a blinding sheet of silver. The heat made the air shimmer, and the distant mountains looked like smudged watercolor paintings. It was late afternoon when the call came through on the park radio. The voice was strained, crackling with static and panic. It was Mr. Evans. Mayday, mayday. This is the vessel Bluebird. We are adrift. Engine won't start. About 2 miles east of the main launch. I grabbed the radio. Bluebird. This is Ranger Station 1. Copy your message. What is the nature of your emergency? Over. My training kicked in, pushing aside the immediate spike of adrenaline. Engine failure was common enough. There was a pause longer than I expected. When he responded, his voice had dropped to a near whisper, tight with a fear that went beyond a simple mechanical issue. The engine, it just died. Right after we saw it. Saw what? Bluebird. Over. Another silence. I could hear the faint sound of one of his children crying in the background. His wife's voice was a muffled, anxious query. Finally, he spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush. Something in the water. I was getting the tube ready for my son. I looked over the side, down into the water. It's so clear you can see deep, and I saw a person down there, maybe 20, 30 feet deep. just floating, staring up. A chill, stark and cold despite the oppressive heat, traced its way down my spine. Bluebird, can you describe what you saw? Was it a swimmer in distress? A diver?
No.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't right. It was pale. So pale. And the eyes, they were just dark spots. It was just hanging there, suspended. And then, God, I swear it started to reach. It lifted its arm, slow, like right up towards the bottom of our boat. I yelled. I don't even know what I said. My wife saw it, too. As soon as it almost touched the hull, the engine just cut out. A perfect, clean cutoff. No sputtering, no warning. Just silence. I stood frozen in my station, the radio handset cold in my palm. Every rational instinct in my head was screaming for a logical explanation. A trick of the light. A submerged mannequin from some prank. A snagged piece of debris that looked vaguely human. But the raw, undiluted terror in his voice was impossible to fake. It was the sound of a man whose understanding of the world had just been shattered. "Okay, Mr. Evans, stay calm," I said, my own voice steadier than I felt. "I'm on my way. Keep your life vests on and try to keep the children calm. I have your position. I will be there in 20 minutes. I dispatched our park patrol boat, a sturdy vessel built for rescues and service. As I locked up the station and headed down to the dock, my mind was racing. For years, I had dismissed the stories. I had smiled politely and filed them away under folklore. But the specificity of his report, the pale figure, the reaching arm, the immediate and inexplicable engine failure, it wasn't just a vague tale of unease. It was a direct echo of the most chilling legends of Lake Apogee, the stories of the drowned reaching up for the living, trying to pull them down into the cold, silent depths. As I pushed the throttle forward and my boat cut through the unnervingly still water, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading towards something far older and more malevolent than a simple stalled engine. The 20-minute journey across the lake felt like an eternity. The patrol boat's engine, usually a comforting, throaty roar, sounded intrusive and loud in the profound stillness of the afternoon. The water, which from my station had looked like polished glass, now appeared dark and opaque, swallowing the light. Every ripple, every splash against the hull seemed amplified. The rational part of my brain, the part that had guided me through 6 years of service, was fighting a losing battle against a primal fear that had been awakened by Mr. Evans's panicked voice. I kept replaying his words a person. Down there, staring up, it started to reach. I scanned the vast, empty expanse, my eyes straining. There was no other boat traffic in this area. The sun was beginning its slow descent towards the jagged peaks of the western ridge, and the light had softened, casting long, distorted shadows across the water's surface. It was the time of day when the world begins to feel less certain, when the familiar shapes of the landscape can play tricks on the eye. I held on to that thought. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. Then I saw them. The Bluebird was exactly where they said they would be, a dark blue speck floating helplessly in the middle of a wide, deep channel. As I drew closer, the scene on board came into focus, and it was a stark, chilling tableau. The vibrant, happy family I had checked in just hours before was gone. In their place were 4 statues carved from fear. Mr. Evans stood at the helm, not touching the controls, just staring out at me with wide, haunted eyes. His wife was huddled on one of the passenger seats, her arms wrapped so tightly around her 2 children that they seemed to be a single entity. The kids weren't crying anymore. They were just silent, their faces buried in their mother's sides. The brightly colored inner tube, the symbol of their intended day of fun, bobbed listlessly in the water behind them, tethered by a rope like a forgotten promise. I cut my engine and coasted the last few feet, my boat bumping gently against their hull. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silence. "Mr. Evans," I called, keeping my voice calm and even. "It's Ranger Thompson. Everyone okay?" He gave a jerky nod, unable to form words. His confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the raw, brittle look of a man who had stared into an abyss. "I'm coming aboard to take a look at your engine," I said, securing my boat to his. As I swung myself over the side, a wave of cold seemed to emanate from the Bluebird itself. It was likely just my imagination, my own anxiety projecting itself onto the situation, but the feeling was undeniable. The air around their boat felt colder, heavier. Evans flinched as I landed on the deck. She wouldn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the floor of the boat, as if she were afraid of what she might see if she looked over the side. I addressed her husband. "Sir, tell me exactly what happened." He swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "Just like I said on the radio. 1 minute, everything's fine. The next we saw it, right down there." He pointed a trembling finger into the water beside the boat. I followed his gesture, my heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned over the gunwale and peered down into the depths. The water of Lake Apogee was famously clear, but now it seemed murky, its secrets veiled. I could see nothing but shifting patterns of light and shadow. There was no pale figure, no reaching arm, just the deep, dark, empty blue. "And the moment you saw it, the engine died?" I asked, turning my attention to the engine housing. "Not the moment we saw it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The moment it almost touched us." I didn't press him further. Arguing with a traumatized person was pointless. I needed to focus on the tangible problem, the engine. I was no master mechanic, but I knew my way around a standard inboard motor. I opened the housing and began my methodical inspection. The fuel line was secure, with no leaks or crimps. I checked the primer bulb. It was firm. The battery terminals were clean and tight, and the gauge showed a full charge. I checked the kill switch lanyard. It was properly in place. Everything looked perfect. There was absolutely no logical reason for the engine to have shut down so abruptly. "Did you try to restart it?" I asked. "A dozen times," he said, his voice hollow. "It's dead. Not even a click." I slid into the driver's seat. The vinyl was cool against my skin. I turned the key. He was right. Nothing. No sound, no crank, no electrical hum. It was as if the battery had been completely disconnected from the system. I knew, with a sinking certainty that defied all logic, that if I were to tow this boat back to the marina, the engine would start right up on the trailer. The problem wasn't with the boat. The problem was with the lake. "Okay," I said, forcing a professional tone. "We'll get you back. I'll tow you in." As I moved to my boat to retrieve the tow line, a burst of static erupted from the radio, clipped to my shoulder. It was a harsh, grating sound, followed by a series of clicks, and then a voice, or something that sounded like a voice. It was a low, gurgling whisper, distorted and warped, as if someone were trying to speak from underwater. The words were unintelligible, but the sound itself was filled with a chilling liquid malevolence. "Get out." Or maybe it was, "Let me in." I froze, my hand on the tow rope. Evans stared at me, his face ashen. "Did you hear that?" I pretended to adjust the settings on my radio. "Just interference. We get a lot of atmospheric bounce off the mountains." It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. The sound had not come from the sky. It had felt like it came from the water beneath us, resonating up through the hulls of the boats. The tow back to the launch was the longest 30 minutes of my life. The sun had finally dipped below the ridge, plunging the lake into a deep purple twilight. The Bluebird followed behind my patrol boat like a hearse. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of my engine and the gentle lapping of water against the boats. I could feel the weight of their fear, a palpable thing that traveled up the tow rope and settled in my own gut. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look into the dark water, terrified of what I might see looking back. When we finally reached the docks, it was nearly dark. I helped a shaken Mr. Evans get his boat onto his trailer. The moment the boat was out of the water, a set of interior lights that hadn't worked before flickered on. He didn't seem to notice. He worked with a feverish, desperate energy, his only goal to get his family and his boat away from this place. He didn't want to file a detailed incident report. He waved away my questions with a limp hand. We're done," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. "We're just going to go." He loaded his silent family into the truck, and without another word, drove away, leaving me alone on the ramp under the cold glare of the security lights. I stood there for a long time, the gurgling whisper from the radio echoing in my ears. The easy dismissal I had always afforded the local legends was gone, stripped away by the sheer terror I had witnessed in a good man's eyes and the cold, inexplicable reality of a dead engine and a voice from the deep. Later that night, unable to sleep, I sat in my station, the glow of my computer screen painting my face. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to know. On a hunch, I logged into the park's internal records server and began pulling up old incident reports for Lake Apogee, going back decades. Most were routine minor injuries, lost hikers, boats running out of gas. But then I found it. A report from 1978, filed by a ranger named Arthur Croft. He had responded to a stranded fishing boat. The report was brief, almost cryptic. The fishermen claimed their engine had died for no reason after seeing a pale anomaly in the water. Ranger Croft's official conclusion was probable electrical failure. But attached to the official report was a personal log entry, something he never meant for anyone else to see. His final entry before his abrupt resignation a week later read, he towed them in. Engine started on the trailer. They wouldn't talk about it, but I saw the man's eyes. Same thing I saw last month. The water is getting hungry again. It remembers the town. It remembers the people. And it wants more. Sleep did not come that night. Ranger Arthur Croft's words burned behind my eyelids. The water is getting hungry again. It remembers the town. It remembers the people. And it wants more. The phrase replayed in my mind, a morbid mantra that turned my small, safe station into a cage. Every creak of the cabin's wooden frame, every rustle of leaves in the wind outside, sounded like the prelude to something terrible. The professional skepticism I had cultivated over my career had been washed away in a single afternoon, leaving behind the cold, hard sediment of fear. The legends were no longer just stories. They were operational intelligence, and I was the only one who had it. The next morning I drove into Havenwood, the small town that huddled in the shadow of the national park. My official reason was to pick up supplies, but my real purpose was much more urgent. I needed to find someone who remembered Ranger Croft. Havenwood was the kind of place where memories were long and histories were intertwined. My first stop was the diner, a place where coffee was perpetually brewing and gossip was the main currency. I found what I was looking for in a corner booth. A man named Silas Blackwood, who had been the town's hardware store owner for 50 years, sat nursing a cup of coffee. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes held the wary wisdom of someone who had seen it all. I introduced myself, and after some requisite small talk about the weather and the tourist season, I carefully brought up the name. Silas, I was going through some old park records. I began trying to sound casual. Came across a ranger named Arthur Croft. Worked here back in the 70s. Did you know him? Silas's eyes, which had been friendly and a little distant, sharpened with a sudden focus. He put his cup down with a deliberate click. Art Croft. Haven't heard that name in a long time. Yeah, I knew him. Good man. Knew the woods and the mountains better than anyone, but the lake broke him. What do you mean, it broke him? I asked, leaning forward. He lowered his voice, even though the diner was mostly empty. He was like you. By the book. Didn't put much stock in the old stories. But he saw things. Responded to too many stranded boaters out on the deep channel. Boats with nothing wrong with them. People who looked like they'd seen a ghost. He started talking about the water being wrong. About Silver Creek Bend not being at rest. The submerged town, I said. Silas nodded grimly. That town wasn't just flooded, Ranger. It was drowned. People lost their homes, their history, everything. Some refused to leave. The stories say they chained themselves to their porches. Said they'd rather go down with the town than abandon it. They say their anger, their sorrow, it poisoned the water from the very start. Art, he started to believe it. He tried to get the Park Service to declare the lake unsafe. To close it down for good. They called him crazy. laughed him out of the regional office. He resigned a week later, walked away from the job, his home, everything. Haven't seen or heard from him since. The story sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Croft hadn't just left, he had fled, and he had tried to warn them. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert. Every boat I checked in, every family I wished a safe day on the water, felt like a potential sacrifice I was leading to an altar. I felt a desperate, pressing need to do something. Following Croft's lead, I drafted an official recommendation to my supervisor, citing a series of unexplained mechanical failures and unverified underwater hazards as grounds for a temporary closure of Lake Apogee for a full sonar survey. I knew it was a long shot, just as it had been for Croft, but I had to try hit send on the email and felt a small measure of relief, quickly followed by a large dose of dread. I had just put myself on the record. I had made myself a target, not just for my superior's ridicule, but perhaps for the lake's attention as well. That evening, the response came. It was exactly what I and Silas would have predicted. My supervisor, a career administrator named Peterson, who worked out of an office 200 miles away, was dismissive. He wrote of budget constraints, the peak tourist season, and the lack of concrete evidence. He suggested I take a few days off, that perhaps the stress of the job was getting to me. He finished the email with a professionally passive, aggressive line that made my blood run cold. We can't close a federal park every time a boater forgets to check their fuel line, Blair. Let's stick to the facts. Frustration and fear warred within me. The facts were that a family had been terrorized. The facts were that their engine and Croft's fisherman's engine had failed for no reason. The fact was that a voice had come from my radio that wasn't interference. As darkness fell completely, another call came through. Not on the main radio, but on my park-issued cell phone. It was an automated alert. A boater had failed to check out at the ramp by the designated closing time of 9:00 p.m. The system automatically provides the name and boat registrations, a single occupant, a Mr. Alastair Finch, on a small aluminum fishing boat named the Wanderer. My heart sank. Protocol was clear. I had to go out and look for him. I had to go out onto the lake. At night, every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to call for backup, to wait until morning. But the rules, the duty I had sworn to uphold, were just as loud. A man could be in trouble. He could be injured or adrift. My fear was not a good enough reason to abandon him. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and headed to the patrol boat, my boots echoing on the silent dock. The lake was a vast pool of black ink under a moonless, star-dusted sky. The air was cold and dead still. Starting the engine felt like a sacrilege, a profane roar that shattered a sacred silence. I headed towards the last known area Mr. Finch had mentioned he'd be fishing, a deep section, not far from where the Evans family had been stranded. The beam of my flashlight cut a nervous, dancing path across the black water. The world shrank to just the circle of my light and the oppressive darkness that surrounded it. I found his boat after about 15 minutes of searching. It was adrift, just as the Bluebird had been. It was completely empty. The Wanderer bobbed gently, an empty shell. A fishing rod lay on a seat, its line trailing into the water. A half-empty thermos of coffee sat next to it. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anything. Finch was simply gone. Park patrol to Havenwood dispatch. I said into my radio, my voice trembling. I have located the vessel of the overdue boater, Alastair Finch. The vessel is abandoned. I am beginning a search and rescue pattern. Inform Sheriff's Department. As I finished the transmission, the patrol boat's engine sputtered and died. A perfect, clean cutoff, just like the Evans' boat. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening. I was adrift, in the dark. In an empty boat next to another empty boat, I turned the key. Nothing.
Not a click. My blood turned ice.
Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I grabbed the radio to call in my own situation. Rangersta. The radio crackled, cutting me off. But this time it wasn't just static. It was the voice. The gurgling underwater whisper from before, but it was clearer now. Closer. It was coming from every direction at once. It was the sound of a choir of the drowned. One of us. It whispered through the static. And then another sound, a soft, wet thump against the side of my boat. I whipped my flashlight towards the noise. There, just at the edge of the light, a hand was gripping the gunwale. It was bone white, the skin wrinkled and waterlogged, the fingernails blue. Another thump came from the other side of the boat. I swung the light around. Another hand, then another, and another. They were pulling themselves up from the depths, their pale limbs emerging from the black water. I saw a face rise above the surface, bloated and gray, with dark, empty sockets for eyes, and a mouth gaping in a silent scream. It was the face from Mr. Evans's terrified description. My flashlight beam trembled violently in my hand as I backed away, stumbling into the center of the boat. The whispers from the radio grew louder, weaving together into a single, horrifying word, repeated over and over. Join, join. The boat began to rock, gently at first, then more violently as more hands gripped the sides, their collective weight pulling it down. Below me, through the hole, I could feel a new vibration. It was a low, resonant hum, a deep thrumming that seemed to rise from the very bottom of the lake. I risked a glance over the side, pointing my flashlight down into the abyss. What I saw shattered the last fragments of my sanity. Far below, where the submerged town of Silver Creek Bend should have been nothing but dark, dead ruins, lights were on. Faint, ghostly, phosphorescent lights glowed in the windows of sunken houses and shops, and on the spectral streets below, pale figures were walking. They were looking up, they were looking at me, and they were waiting. The boat lurched, tilting dangerously, and the gurgling whisper filled my ears, no longer from the radio, but from right beside me. Welcome home, Ranger. My name is Petronella Nightingale, and for the past 8 years, I have worked as a wildlife biologist for the Bureau of Land Management. My official title is a mouthful, but most people just call me a ranger. My domain is a vast, unforgiving expanse of desert badlands in the American Southwest, a place of stark beauty and profound silence. It's a landscape carved by wind and time, where monolithic rock formations stand like ancient, slumbering sentinels against a bleached blue sky. People see pictures of it and think it's beautiful, and it is, but it's a beauty that carries an implicit warning. This land is not welcoming. It is indifferent, and it will kill the careless without a second thought. My job is varied, but it primarily revolves around conservation and management. I track bygone sheep populations, monitor endangered desert tortoises, and for the past several weeks, I have been tasked with managing the local coyote population. This isn't a cull. We don't use lethal methods unless absolutely necessary. Instead, my work involves setting a series of live-catch, non-lethal traps across a 50-square-mile grid. The goal is to catch, tag, and collect data on the coyotes before releasing them. It's tedious, solitary work that requires patience, a deep understanding of animal behavior, and a high tolerance for blistering heat and isolation. I happen to possess all three. I've always been more comfortable in the company of silence than in a crowded room. The Badlands offer silence in its purest form. It's a living entity, so deep and complete that you can feel it pressing in on you. The only interruptions are the natural ones, the rasp of the wind scarring the sandstone, the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling on a thermal, the scuttling of a collared lizard across hot rock. You learn the language of this silence, the rhythm of the desert. Your senses become attuned to it. You know what belongs, and more importantly, you know what doesn't. That particular Tuesday started like any other. I was up before the sun, the air still holding a remnant of the night's coolness. I loaded my gear into the government-issued pickup truck, traps, water, tagging kits, GPS, a high-powered radio, and my trusty bolt-action rifle, which I carried more for peace of mind than any real expectation of using it. The drive to the edge of my grid took over an hour on a winding, pockmarked service road. From there, it was another 2 hours on foot to my first trap line. The sun climbed, relentlessly turning the landscape into a shimmering, heat-hazed furnace. Sweat trickled down my temples, and the air was so dry it felt like it was pulling the moisture directly from my lungs. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Find the trap I'd set 2 days prior. Check it for an animal. If it was empty, I'd rebait it with a piece of scent, soaked sponge, and reset the pressure plate. If it held a coyote, I'd work quickly and quietly to sedate it, draw blood, take measurements, attach an ear tag, and let it go on its way, dazed but unharmed. By midday, I had checked 6 traps, all empty. This wasn't unusual. Coyotes are cunning, and this particular pack was proving to be especially wary. I found a sliver of shade under a granite overhang to eat my lunch, a squashed sandwich and a lukewarm canteen of water. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the vast, empty space and the low hum of heat in my ears. It was in this profound stillness that I first heard it. It was faint, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A whisper on the edge of hearing. I stopped chewing and tilted my head, straining to listen. Nothing. I shrugged it off. The sun can play tricks on you. The isolation can make you hear things. It's a known phenomenon among people who spend a lot of time alone in the wilderness. Your brain, starved for stimulus, starts creating its own. I finished my lunch, packed up my things, and moved on. The next trap was 1.5 miles away, in a shallow, sandy wash flanked by steep, eroded cliffs. The heat was at its peak now, a physical weight. As I knelt to check the bait, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. A voice. A human voice. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My hand instinctively went to the radio on my hip. I slowly rose to my feet, scanning the tops of the cliffs, the vast, empty plains beyond. Nothing. Not a flicker of movement. The voice hadn't been a word, just a sound, a kind of muffled cry. It was impossible. The nearest official trail was over 30 miles away. No one came out here. There were no registered hiking or camping permits for this entire sector. The only person for 50 miles was me. My heart was thudding against my ribs. Hello, I called out, my own voice sounding thin and alien in the oppressive silence. The only answer was the echo of my own word, bouncing off the canyon walls and fading into nothing. I stood there for a long time listening. The rational part of my brain was working overtime, trying to find an explanation. A stray hiker, hopelessly lost. A prospector, maybe. But they would have a vehicle, and I would have seen tracks. There was nothing. No footprints other than my own and the delicate tracks of kangaroo rats. No tire marks on the service road other than my trucks. I dismissed it again, with more effort this time. It had to be the wind, funneling through a hole in the rock in a strange way, mimicking a human sound. It had to be. I finished my work at the 7th trap and started the long trek towards the 8th. My senses on high alert. The comfortable solitude I usually cherished had been replaced by a prickling sense of being watched. Every shadow seemed to harbor a secret. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper. It was late afternoon when I reached the final trap, located on a wide, flat mesa that offered a panoramic view of the desolate landscape. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple. The shadows grew long and distorted, turning familiar rock formations into grotesque shapes. It was here that the illusion of normalcy was shattered completely and irrevocably. I was logging the trap's status in my notebook when the sound came again, not from one direction, but from all around me. It wasn't one voice anymore. It was many. They were the voices of children. They were faint, carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable. High-pitched, desperate. They weren't laughing or playing. They were crying out, and they were all saying the same word. Help. A wave of ice, cold dread washed over me, so intense it made me feel nauseous. I dropped my notebook and spun around, my eyes wide, searching the empty horizon. The voices were everywhere and nowhere at once. A chorus of unseen, pleading children, their calls echoing across miles of barren, hostile terrain where no child could possibly be. Help us. A little girl's voice, seemingly right behind me. I whirled around. Nothing. Just cracked earth and the setting sun. Please, help. A boy's voice, seeming to drift down from the empty sky above. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers clumsy and shaking. I I switched it to the main channel. Dispatch, this is Nightingale, I said, my voice cracking. Dispatch, do you copy? The radio crackled to life. We copy, Nightingale.
What's your status?
Dispatch, I'm hearing voices. Multiple voices. It sounds like children calling for help. There was a pause. The disembodied pleas continued to swirl around me in the wind. Help, so cold. Nightingale. The dispatcher's voice came back, calm and professional, but with an underlying edge of concern. Can you confirm your location? I gave her my coordinates from the GPS. I'm on the North Mesa. The sounds they're all around me. Are there any reports of missing persons in my area? Any missing children? The pause this time was longer. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard in the background. The children's voices were getting weaker, more distant, like a fading radio signal. Negative, Nightingale. The dispatcher said, her voice now tight with a tension that mirrored my own. There are no active missing persons reports in your entire sector. There are no permits issued, no vehicles logged. According to our records, you are the only person out there. You are completely alone. The dispatcher's words hung in the air, colder and heavier than the approaching night. You are completely alone. The radio hissed with static, a sound that suddenly felt like the universe laughing at my terror. Alone. The word echoed in my mind, a stark contradiction to the chorus of desperate, childish whispers that had just surrounded me. The voices had faded now, not abruptly, but slowly, like the last embers of a fire dying out, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with the memory of those cries. My training, my instincts, my 8 years of experience in this wilderness all screamed at me to stay rational. There had to be an explanation. Ventriloquism by the wind. Auditory hallucinations brought on by dehydration and heat exhaustion. My own mind, starved for human contact, playing tricks on me. I clung to these logical possibilities like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood, but they felt flimsy, unconvincing. The experience had been too real, too specific. The sheer number of voices, the clarity of their pleas, the way they seemed to come from every direction at once, it defied any easy explanation. I stood frozen on the mesa for what felt like an eternity, caught between the instinct to flee and the professional duty to investigate. But investigate what? The empty air. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, but what good was a firearm against a sound? The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, and the desert was plunging into a deep, velvety darkness. The temperature was dropping fast. I knew I had to move. Staying out here after dark without proper gear was a death sentence. Nightingale, are you there? The dispatcher's voice crackled, pulling me back from the edge of panic. I'm here. I managed to say, my throat dry. I'm heading back to the truck. The sounds have stopped. Roger that, Nightingale. Maintain radio contact. Report in when you're back at the vehicle. Copy. I said, my voice barely a whisper. The walk back was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every step was a battle against my own spiraling fear. The familiar landscape I knew like the back of my hand had transformed into a hostile, alien world. The monolithic rock formations, once majestic sentinels, now loomed like grotesque monsters in the gloom, their long shadows writhing and dancing in the pale moonlight. I used my headlamp, but its narrow beam only seemed to make the surrounding darkness deeper and more menacing. It sliced through the night, illuminating a small circle of ground ahead of me, leaving the vast, crushing emptiness on all sides to my imagination. I found myself jumping at every sound. The scuttling of a scorpion, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind through a crevice. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, a primal, unshakable feeling of being followed nipping at my heels. The silence of the Badlands was no longer a comfort, it was an antagonist. It felt like it was listening, waiting. I gripped the stock of my rifle, its cold, hard weight a small and insufficient comfort. I was making my way through a narrow wash, my boots sinking into the soft sand with each step, when the beam of my headlamp caught something half buried in the dirt. It wasn't a rock or a piece of desert scrub. It was the distinct shape and color of something man-made. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need to find something tangible in this nightmare of intangibles, overrode my fear. I knelt down and brushed away the sand. It was a doll. A little girl's doll, maybe 6 inches tall. It was made of hard plastic, the kind that was popular decades ago. Its painted on blue eyes stared up at me with a vacant, unnerving expression. Its yellow plastic hair was matted with dirt, and its simple pink dress was faded and torn. One of its arms was missing. It was old, weathered by years, perhaps decades of exposure to the brutal desert elements. A chill, entirely separate from the cold night air, traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just out of place, it was impossible. We find trash in the wilderness sometimes. A stray water bottle, a forgotten candy wrapper near a trailhead. But this was different. This was miles from any road or trail, in a sector that saw virtually no human traffic. Who would bring a doll out here? And why would they leave it behind? I picked it up. It felt strangely heavy in my hand. As I turned it over, sand trickled out from a crack in its hollow body. The feeling of being watched intensified, so powerful now that the hair on my arm stood on end. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get away, to leave this place and this object behind. I dropped the doll as if it had burned me, scrambled back to my feet, and practically ran the rest of the way through the wash, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Reaching my truck should have been a moment of profound relief, but it wasn't. The familiar white pickup, my mobile office and lifeline, seemed like a fragile, tin-plated box against the immense, predatory darkness that now owned the desert. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, its familiar rumble a welcome intrusion into the hostile silence. I radioed dispatch to let them know I was mobile, my voice tight and strained. The long, bumpy drive back to the ranger station was agonizing. I had the heater blasting, but I couldn't seem to get warm. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a small face staring back at me from the empty back seat. The winding dirt road, illuminated only by my headlights, felt like a tunnel through an infinite void. When I finally arrived at my small, isolated station, little more than a glorified cabin with an office attached, I didn't feel safe. I felt trapped. I left every light on, checked the locks on the doors and windows 3 times, and sat at my desk, the silence of the station feeling just as oppressive as the silence of the desert. Sleep was out of the question. My mind was a whirlwind of the day's events, the disembodied voices, the dispatcher's chilling confirmation, the vacant stare of that forgotten doll. I needed answers. I needed to prove myself wrong, to find a rational thread to pull on that would unravel this whole terrifying tapestry. Fueled by adrenaline and coffee, I turned to my computer and began to dig. I started with the Bureau's official records, searching for any incident reports, unusual sightings, or geological surveys that might explain strange acoustics in the North Mesa sector. Nothing. Then I waded my search to county records, historical archives, and old digitized newspapers, my keywords becoming more specific: missing family, lost children, desert tragedy. Cross-reference with the name of the area, a name rarely used now, the Diablo's Spine. For hours, I found nothing but mining claims and weather reports. But then, deep within the archives of a local paper from 1968, I found it. It wasn't a headline. It was a small article, just a few paragraphs long, buried in the back pages. The title was simple: Family Vanishes on Desert Trip. It detailed the disappearance of the Jacobson family, a husband, a wife, and their 3 young children. They had been on their way to visit relatives, had decided to take a scenic detour through the Badlands, and were never seen again. Their car was found abandoned on an old, disused service road weeks later. There were no signs of foul play, just a car out of gas and a set of footprints. 2 adult, 3 small, leading off into the vast, empty desert, heading directly towards the Diablo's Spine. The subsequent search, one of the largest in the state's history, found nothing. Not a trace. It was as if the desert had simply swallowed them whole. My blood ran cold as I read the last line of the article. It listed the names and ages of the missing children, Mark. Age 9, David, age 7, and little Sarah, age 5. It was Sarah's age that made my breath catch in my throat. 5 years old, the perfect age to be carrying a small plastic doll in a simple pink dress. I looked at my shaking hands, remembering the feel of the doll, the vacant stare of its painted on eyes. The voices I heard weren't a trick of the wind. They were an echo of a 50-year-old tragedy trapped in the place where it happened. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my job tomorrow would take me right back into the heart of it. Sleep did not come that night. The ranger station, once my fortress of solitude, felt more like a cage. The glow from every single light I'd left on did nothing to banish the darkness that had seeped into my soul. The computer screen still displayed the old news article from 1968, its black text on a faded white background looking like a final judgment. The Jacobson family, Mark, David, and little Sarah. Their names were no longer just data, they were whispers that haunted the silence. The fear from the day before had morphed into something else, something heavier. It was a burden, a strange sense of responsibility to the lost souls who had been trapped in that desolate land for over half a century. I wasn't going back because it was my job anymore. Checking coyote traps seemed utterly absurd compared to this unresolved tragedy. I was going back because no one else could. I was the only one who had heard their calls, the only one who knew that the echo of their pain still resonated among the rocks and ravines of the Diablo's spine. Dawn arrived with a muted, gray light that washed over the desert. I hadn't slept a wink, yet I felt strangely alert, adrenaline and purpose having replaced exhaustion. I loaded the necessary gear into my truck. Water, a first aid kit, my GPS, and the radio. But this time I left the rifle behind. I knew now that whatever I was about to face, a bullet couldn't touch it. On impulse, I grabbed a small field shovel and a large, clean canvas sheet, not entirely sure why, only that it felt like the right thing to do. The drive back along the same route was profoundly different from the day before. The aimless fear was replaced by a grim determination. The landscape no longer looked monstrous, but deeply sad. Every rock, every long shadow, seemed to be a silent witness to the suffering that had occurred here. I didn't head for the mesa where I'd first heard the voices. Instead, I drove as far as I could down that old, forgotten service road, the same one where the Jacobsons' car had been found. Then I set out on foot, not following my trap line, but following the invisible footprints recorded in a 50-year-old news article, heading straight for the heart of the Diablo's spine. The silence of the day was different from the silence of the night. It wasn't menacing, but expectant, as if the entire desert was holding its breath. I followed the dry wash where I had found the doll, not stopping to look for it, just sensing that I was moving in the right direction. About an hour into my hike, I heard them again. It started faintly, just as before, a child's whisper on the wind. But this time, it wasn't frightening. It felt like an invitation. This way, a little girl's voice. Sarah, I was sure of it. I followed the sound. It led me out of the wash and up a steep scree-covered slope. The terrain was rough and treacherous, a place the original search parties might have easily overlooked. The whispers continued to guide me, sometimes as clear as if they were right beside me, other times so faint they could have been a thought. Almost there, a boy's voice. David or Mark, I couldn't tell. I could feel their presence all around me, not as terrifying specters, but as memories imprinted on the land. I saw flickers of movement in the corner of my eye, the shape of a small child darting behind a boulder. I heard the ghost of a giggle that quickly turned into a sob. It wasn't a haunting, it was a sharing of their despair. Finally, the voices led me to the base of a massive rock face. At its bottom was a large pile of boulders and debris from a long-ago rock slide. It was an unremarkable spot, giving no hint of its significance, but it was here that all the whispers converged into one. In here, so cold. My heart pounded. I looked at the jumble of rocks. There was a small gap between a few of them, obscured by shadow, too small for an adult to easily notice. But for frightened children looking for shelter, it might have looked like a perfect refuge. I set down my gear and began to dig carefully with the shovel. The packed, dry earth and rock were difficult to move, but I worked with a strength I didn't know I possessed. After nearly half an hour, I managed to shift a key boulder, opening a gap just large enough for me to squeeze through. It was dark and cool inside, the air still and ancient. I switched on my headlamp. Its beam cut through the blackness, illuminating a small, natural cavern. It wasn't a deep cave, just a hollow space hidden behind the rockfall. And there, in the beam of my light, I found them. They lay together as if they were sleeping. Time in the desert had taken everything from them, leaving only clean, white bones. But their positions told the entire story. 2 larger skeletons were wrapped tightly around 3 smaller ones, a final futile attempt to shield them from the cold and the dark. The parents comforting their children as hope faded with the sun. Scattered around them were the last remnants of their lives. An empty canteen, scraps of fabric from their clothing, and next to the smallest skeleton, I saw a small piece of plastic, one arm missing. The doll, or perhaps its twin. I had found the end of the Jacobsons' tragic journey. As I stood there, a mixture of profound sadness and stark relief washing over me, the entire feeling in the cavern shifted. The whispers that had swirled around me were gone. The cold presence had vanished, replaced by a deep, profound calm. It wasn't the menacing silence of the desert anymore. It was the silence of rest. The echo had delivered its message. They hadn't been crying out for help. They had just been crying out to be found. I backed out slowly, emerging into the bright sun, blinking against the light, tears streaming down my face. I reached for my radio, my hand trembling slightly. "Dispatch, this is Nightingale," I said, my voice strangely calm. "We copy Nightingale. Are you okay?" "I'm okay," I replied. "Dispatch." I found them. I found the Jacobson family. The silence on the other end was thick with shock and disbelief, but I calmly relayed my coordinates and what I had discovered. I didn't go back to the truck right away. I unfolded the canvas sheet I had brought and sat down on a flat rock, not far from the entrance to their final resting place. I sat and waited for the recovery team that would take hours to arrive, looking out over the vast expanse of the desert. The afternoon sun was warm, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was a silence filled with story, a silence that held the memory of all who had passed through this place. And in that silence, I felt a sense of peace, not just for the Jacobsons, but for myself as well. My name is Clifford Hayes, but most folks out here just call me Cliff. For the better part of 2 decades, I've had the privilege of calling the vast, emerald expanse of the Pacific Northwest my office. As a park ranger, my duties are varied, but my heart has always been in the backcountry, on the trails that snake through ancient forests like green veins on a slumbering giant. I've worked primarily in the areas managed under the Mount Baker, Snoqualmie National Forest Administration, a territory of staggering beauty and profound, sometimes intimidating, solitude. You learn the rhythms of a place like this, the sigh of the wind through the canopy of Douglas firs, the sharp, chattering cry of a Steller's jay, the specific scent of damp earth and decaying cedar after a morning rain. You become a part of it, and it becomes a part of you. Over the years, I've seen my share of strange things. I've stumbled upon illegal logging operations in the dead of night, dealt with poachers who looked more like phantoms than men, and rescued hikers who had pushed their luck one ridge too far. I've tracked cougars, had staring contests with black bears, and felt the ground tremble from a herd of migrating elk. I thought I had a working knowledge of every predator, every sound, every secret the forest held. I was a man of logic, of evidence. The wilderness, for all its wildness, operated on a set of rules, cause and effect, predator and prey, life and death. It was a complex but ultimately understandable system. At least, that's what I believed until that late, autumn afternoon on a forgotten spur of the Linden Creek Trail. The Linden Creek Trail wasn't a popular road. It was a rugged, often overgrown path that required more maintenance than it was probably worth. But it was my project for the week. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a cold night, and the sky was a sheet of brushed steel, filtering the sunlight into a soft, ethereal glow. The forest here was particularly dense, a cathedral of green and brown where 100-foot, tall trees blotted out most of the sky. Their trunks were thick as columns, draped in moss that hung like the tattered robes of old kings. The silence was immense, broken only by the rhythmic scrape and chop of my Pulaski as I cleared a section of trail blocked by a fallen hemlock. It was hard, satisfying work, the kind that makes you feel your muscles burn and your lungs heave, but leaves you with a clean sense of accomplishment. Around 3 in the afternoon, I decided to take a break. I leaned my tool against the downed log, pulled a canteen from my pack, and rested my back against the trunk of a particularly massive western red cedar. I took a long drink, letting the cool water soothe my throat, and scanned the woods around me. That's when I noticed the quiet. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet of the deep woods. It was a heavy quiet, a listening quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The usual rustle of squirrels and chipmunks in the undergrowth was gone. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. It's a feeling seasoned outdoorsmen learn to trust. The silent alarm that tells you something is out of place. A predator is near. My first thought, naturally, was a cougar. They are the masters of stealth, ghosts of the forest. I scanned the dense thickets of salal and sword fern, my hand resting near the butt of the holstered sidearm. I carried more for protocol than any real expectation of using it. I saw nothing. No flicker of movement, no glint of watching eyes. I pushed myself off the cedar, deciding my break was over. As my hand slid from the bark, my fingers brushed against something that didn't feel right. It wasn't the familiar rough, fibrous texture of the cedar. It was a set of deep, parallel grooves splintering the wood. I turned to look properly, and the unease in my gut curdled into a cold knot of confusion. There, at about shoulder height, were 4 deep gouges clawed into the trunk. These weren't from a bear. I've seen hundreds of examples of bear markings, scratches, bites, trees they've rubbed against. A black bear's claws might scar the outer bark, maybe dig in an inch or so if the wood is soft. These were different. They were unnaturally deep, plunging at least 3 to 4 inches into the dense, living wood. The sheer power required to do that was difficult to comprehend. The splinters of wood around the edges of the marks were as thick as my fingers. Furthermore, the spacing was wrong. They were too far apart for a bear's paw, and there was a savage, deliberate quality to them. It looked less like an animal marking its territory and more like something had simply tested its strength, shredding the ancient tree for no reason at all. I ran my fingers over the gouges. They were relatively fresh. I could still smell the sharp, clean scent of the exposed heartwood, a smell like raw turpentine. My logical mind scrambled for an explanation. A prank. Someone with a custom-made tool trying to spook people. It seemed unlikely. Getting this far up the Linden Creek Trail with heavy equipment, just for a practical joke, was a stretch. And the raw, violent energy of the marks felt intensely real. No human with a hand tool could do this. This was rage. This was power. My curiosity now overriding my unease, I began to search the area. My eyes, trained to spot trail markers and animal tracks, were now looking for signs of this new, impossible thing. 20 yards away, I found another set of marks on a towering Douglas fir. These were even more disturbing. They started at about 5 feet off the ground and went straight up, ending at a height I estimated to be close to 9, maybe 10 feet. I stood there, staring up, my canteen forgotten in my hand. No bear on earth could make marks like that. A grizzly, maybe, standing on its hind legs, but we didn't have grizzlies this far west in the Cascades. And even then, the depth of the cuts was just wrong. It was as if a machine had done it, a small backhoe with steel claws. But there were no tracks, no sign of any machine. Just my own boot prints on the damp soil of the trail. I felt it then, stronger than ever, the feeling of being watched. It was a physical pressure, a weight on my shoulders and the back of my neck. The forest no longer felt like my office. It felt like someone else's home, and I was an intruder who had just stumbled upon a very private, very violent display. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the light in the undergrowth was taking on a darker, more menacing quality. The emerald gloom was deepening into a shadowy void. I knew I needed to leave. The trail maintenance could wait. Whatever was out here, I wanted to be as far away from it as possible when darkness fell. I gathered my gear, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate, fighting the urge to break into a frantic run. Every snapped twig, every rustle of my own pack sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. I slung my pack over my shoulders, took one last look at the clawed fir tree, and turned to head back down the trail toward my truck, which was parked miles away. I had taken maybe 5 steps when the sound hit me. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a roar. It was something in between, a sound that seemed to tear its way out of a massive chest. It was a deep, guttural, resonating blast of sound that was filled with such raw, territorial fury that my blood ran cold. It vibrated in my bones, an ancient and terrifying noise that the human brain is simply not equipped to process. It was the sound of a predator, an apex predator, warning me that I had trespassed, that I had seen what I should not have seen, and that I was no longer welcome. The sound echoed through the silent trees, seeming to come from my left, my right, and from somewhere deep in the shadows in front of me, all at the same time. I froze, my body locked in a primal state of terror. All my years of experience, all my training, all my logical understanding of the world evaporated in that single, horrifying moment. I was no longer a park ranger, I was just meat. And the butcher was somewhere very, very close. For a few seconds that stretched into an eternity, I was completely paralyzed. My brain, the logical problem-solving machine that had served me so well for 47 years, simply shut down. It was overloaded by a single, terrifying sensory input, that guttural, chest-rattling roar. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my muscles were locked, my boots seemingly fused to the loamy earth. The sound had come from everywhere at once, a ventriloquist trick from hell itself, designed to disorient and terrify. It painted a picture in my mind of immense lungs, a throat lined with razors, and a mouth full of teeth long and sharp enough to puncture steel. The world had shrunk to the space between heartbeats, each one a deafening drum against my ribs. Then a branch snapped in the gloom to my left. It wasn't the gentle crack of a dead twig under a deer's hoof. It was a loud, percussive crack like a baseball bat being swung against a tree. That was the stimulus my body needed. The paralysis broke, and pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my system. I didn't make a conscious decision to run. My legs simply took over. I pivoted on my heel and bolted down the trail, away from the sound, away from the clawed trees, away from the suffocating, watchful silence. My controlled, professional demeanor was gone, replaced by the frantic desperation of a prey animal. The years of training in moving quietly and efficiently through the wilderness vanished. I was a clumsy, terrified man, crashing through the undergrowth, my heavy pack throwing me off balance, the handle of my Pulaski catching on low, hanging branches. I didn't care about noise. I didn't care about grace. My only objective was distance. Behind me, the forest erupted. Something was moving, and it was moving fast. It wasn't running on the trail. It was running through the forest, parallel to me. The sounds were horrifying. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a cougar. It was heavier. I could hear the substantial thud of its footfalls, each one seeming to shake the very ground. Saplings and bushes were being obliterated, not pushed aside, but shattered, torn apart by the passage of something huge and unstoppable. The noise was of pure locomotive power, a force of nature that didn't bother with obstacles, but simply demolished them. Panic clawed at my throat, making my breathing ragged and loud. Don't look back, I told myself, the words a silent mantra in my screaming mind. Just run. Don't look back. The trail was uneven, a mess of roots and rocks, and I stumbled several times, my ankles twisting, my arms pinwheeling for balance. Each stumble sent a fresh wave of ice, cold terror through me. I imagined massive, clawed hands reaching for my pack, of being dragged down into the ferns and moss, of a hot, fetid breath on the back of my neck. The light was fading fast now. The sun had dipped below the western ridges, and the forest was descending into a deep, murky twilight. Familiar shapes became monstrous. The gnarled trunks of ancient cedars looked like hunched figures, and the drooping moss transformed into grasping, skeletal fingers. The world I knew, the forest that was my sanctuary, had become a place of alien horror. It was no longer my home, it was its lair. The sounds of pursuit were relentless, and they were getting closer. I could hear a low, continuous growl now, a rumbling engine of pure malice that seemed to be driving the creature forward. Interspersed with the growl were heavy, huffing breaths, the sound of massive lungs working hard. It was gaining on me. Despite my desperate, headlong sprint, it was faster. Its stride was immense. For every 3 steps I took, it seemed to take only 1. I had to risk it. I needed to know what was hunting me. On a relatively straight stretch of trail, I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was the single most terrifying mistake of my life. For a split second, I saw it. The failing light and the dense trees made it little more than a silhouette, but it was a silhouette that will be forever burned into my memory. It was huge, far larger than any black bear. It was moving on 2 legs in a loping, impossibly fast gait. Its shoulders were broad and powerful, and its long arms swung at its sides. But the head was wrong. It wasn't the round, familiar shape of a bear. It was elongated, canine, with a long snout and what I could have sworn were pointed ears silhouetted against the dying light. It was there, and then it was gone, swallowed by the shadow of a massive fir tree. Dogman, werewolf, the words, once the stuff of campfire tales and cheap horror novels, screamed in my mind. The sight, brief as it was, broke the last remnants of my rational mind. This wasn't an animal. It was a monster, a cryptid, a thing that wasn't supposed to exist, and it was 20 yards behind me and closing the gap. A fresh surge of terror gave me a burst of speed. The trail ahead began to slope downwards more steeply, and I let gravity take me, my legs pumping like pistons, my boots barely touching the ground. I flew down the path, rocks skittering away from my feet, my lungs burning as if I were inhaling fire. I had to get to my truck. It was my only hope, a steel box of safety in a world that had suddenly turned into a nightmare. After what felt like an eternity of running, I saw it. Through a break in the trees, I caught the dull glint of my Ranger, issue Ford F-150, parked in the small gravel pull-out where the trail met the old logging road. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The sight of it gave me my last reserve of strength. I burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel, the crunch of my boots loud and jarring after the soft earth of the forest. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, my fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. The metallic jingle was a beacon of hope. Behind me, the crashing sounds from the forest stopped abruptly at the edge of the trees. I didn't dare look. I knew it was there, watching me from the shadows. I jammed the key into the door lock, my hand shaking so violently it took 2 tries. The click of the lock opening was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I wrenched the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, mashing the lock button on the armrest. I was a mess, gasping for air, my heart hammering like it wanted to break free from my chest. My hands, still trembling, struggled to get the key into the ignition. Turn. Please, turn. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. I slammed the truck into drive, the tires spinning on the loose gravel, and stomped on the accelerator. As the truck lurched forward, a tremendous beenge erupted from the driver's side rear panel. The entire truck shuddered with the force of the impact, and a sound like metal being torn screamed through the cab. I yelled out a raw, involuntary cry of shock and terror, and swerved wildly before regaining control. I didn't slow down. I floored it, fishtailing down the gravel road, my headlights cutting a frantic path through the encroaching darkness. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I couldn't. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the road ahead. I drove until the gravel turned to pavement, and I didn't ease up on the accelerator until the warm, reassuring lights of the main ranger station appeared in the distance. Only then did I allow myself to believe that I might actually survive. My body was trembling uncontrollably, and a cold sweat drenched my clothes. But I was alive, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the world I thought I knew was gone forever. I practically fell out of the truck when I parked it in my designated spot at the ranger station. My legs were jelly, and the violent, full body tremors hadn't subsided. I slammed the truck door shut, the sound echoing in the unnerving quiet of the late evening. The station was mostly empty, with just the warm, yellow light of the main office spilling out into the parking lot. Frank Henderson, a grizzled veteran ranger who was pulling the night shift, looked up from his desk as I stumbled through the door. The look on his face shifted from mild curiosity to genuine alarm. "Cliff, my godson, what happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't form a coherent sentence. My mouth opened, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. I leaned against the doorframe, gasping for air that didn't seem to have enough oxygen in it. My clothes were soaked with sweat and streaked with dirt from my frantic flight. Frank was out of his chair in an instant, his steadying hand on my shoulder. "Easy now. Come on, sit down. You're white as a sheet." He guided me to a chair and pushed a cup of water into my shaking hands. I managed to take a few sips, the cool liquid a small anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind. Something out on Linden Creek." I managed to stammer. "Something big." Frank's brow furrowed. He was a man who had seen it all, or so I thought. He was calm, patient, letting me catch my breath. "A bear. We had reports of a big male boar in that sector." I shook my head vehemently, sloshing water onto the floor. "No, not a bear. Bigger, faster." I couldn't bring myself to say more. How could I explain a two-legged, canine-headed monster without sounding like I'd completely lost my mind? How could I describe the sound, the intelligence in its pursuit, the sheer malice I had felt radiating from it? "All right, son. We'll talk about it in the morning," Frank said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're done for the night. Go home, get some rest. Whatever it was, you got away from it. That's what matters." He saw I was in no condition to drive and ended up taking me home to my small cabin on the edge of town, my own truck left behind at the station under the humming security lights. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that loping, monstrous silhouette and the impossibly deep gouges in the trunk of that cedar. The next morning, I returned to the station with Frank. The bright, clinical light of day did nothing to dispel the horror. It only made it feel more real, more terrifyingly intrusive into the normal world. "I want you to look at the truck," I said, my voice hoarse. We walked out into the parking lot. From a distance, the F-150 looked fine. But as we got closer, Frank let out a low whistle. The damage was on the driver's side, just behind the rear wheel well. It wasn't a dent or a scrape. It was 4 deep, parallel gouges torn into the thick sheet metal of the truck bed. The metal was peeled back like the lid of a tin can, revealing the darker framework underneath. The punctures were deep, and the edges of the torn steel were razor sharp. Below the main gouges, the paint was scraped away in a wide arc, as if by the same claws in a raking motion. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair. He knelt, examining the marks closely, his face a mask of disbelief. "Cliff, what in God's name did this?" He looked at me, his eyes wide. "This isn't a bear. A bear couldn't do this. The force, it's like a hydraulic press." "I know," I said quietly. That was my proof. That was the one tangible piece of evidence that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. We went to see our supervisor, a man named Davis. He was a practical, no-nonsense manager, more concerned with budgets and paperwork than backcountry lore. We brought him out to the truck. He stood in silence for a long time, just staring at the damage. He walked around it, touched the torn metal with his fingertips, and looked from the gouges to my pale, haunted face. I told him the story then. I left out the part about the dog like Head, the bipedal, running. I just described the size, the speed, the sound, and the marks on the trees. I told him it chased me for miles and struck my truck as I fled. When I finished, Davis sighed a long, weary sound. He looked at Frank, then back at me. "Officially," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you were charged by a large, highly aggressive black bear. It was a territorial display. You were clearing a trail, made a lot of noise, and surprised it. The damage to the vehicle occurred when the animal struck it in its agitation before retreating." I started to protest, but Davis, "You see the marks? You know a bear." He held up a hand, cutting me off. "I know what I'm putting in the report, Cliff." It was a bear. He looked me dead in the eye, and in that moment, I saw something other than bureaucratic dismissal. It was a flicker of understanding, maybe even fear. "We're closing the Linden Creek Trail indefinitely, effective immediately. Citing unstable trail conditions and aggressive wildlife activity. Let the forest have it back. Some places are best left alone." And that was that. The official story was a lie, a neat and tidy explanation that fit into our understandable world. The truth was far too messy, far too terrifying. I understood then that Davis wasn't just dismissing me. He was protecting me, protecting the other rangers, protecting the fragile illusion of a world that made sense. He knew or suspected that something was out there that shouldn't be, and the best course of action was to simply wall it off. I took a leave of absence. I couldn't face the woods. My sanctuary had become a source of profound terror. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the snap of a twig in the night, every sound was a potential threat. I was a prisoner of my own fear. When I finally returned to work, I took a desk job, processing permits and answering phone calls. My colleagues were kind, assuming I was suffering from a form of PTSD after a bear attack. And no one pushed me. But I could feel the forest's presence, even from miles away. It was a living, breathing entity, and I had stumbled into a part of it that was ancient and hungry. Months passed. The seasons changed. Autumn gave way to a cold, wet winter. I sold my truck. I couldn't stand to look at the new, perfectly repaired panel. I tried to forget. But every night, the nightmare replayed itself. It's spring now. The snow is melting in the high country, and the world is turning green again. I live in my small cabin, keeping to myself. The back of my property borders the national forest. It's a border I never cross. I'm writing this now on my back porch. The sun has just set, and the sky is a beautiful, bruised purple. The air is still. A few minutes ago, the evening bird song abruptly stopped. The familiar, peaceful quiet has been replaced by that other kind of quiet. The heavy, listening silence I remember from that afternoon on the Linden Creek Trail. A cold dread is seeping into my bones. I feel it, the same oppressive, physical sensation of being watched. And then I hear it. From the dark, silent wall of trees at the edge of my property, maybe 100 yards away. It starts low, a rumbling in a massive chest, then builds. It's the same sound, the same guttural, furious, territorial roar that tore my world apart. It's not a memory. It's not a nightmare. It's here. It remembers me. It knows where I live. And this time, there's nowhere left to run. My name is Ren Hawthorne, and for the last 6 years, I've had the distinct honor of serving as a park ranger with the U.S. National Park Service. It's a title I wear with pride. There's a certain nobility to it, a sense of purpose that's hard to find in the modern world. We are the stewards of America's most sacred natural cathedrals, the guardians of silent, towering forests and sun-drenched, empty canyons. My official duties involve everything from trail maintenance and wildlife management to search and rescue operations and visitor education. Most days, it's the best job on the planet. You feel a connection to something ancient and powerful, something that was here long before us and will remain long after we're gone. My current posting is at Blackwood Creek National Park, a sprawling expanse of dense forest, rugged hills, and winding river valleys in the Pacific Northwest. It's not one of the famous parks, not a Yellowstone or a Yosemite. We're more of a well, kept secret, a destination for serious hikers, dedicated anglers, and people looking to truly disconnect. And disconnect you will. Cell service is a myth in most of the park, and the Wi-Fi at the main visitor center is notoriously temperamental. I'm assigned to the Whisperwind Cabin District, one of the most isolated sections of Blackwood Creek. It's a cluster of 10 rustic rental cabins nestled deep in a valley, a good 45-minute drive on a winding, often treacherous gravel road from the Central Ranger Station. Out here, you are the sole authority. You are the first responder, the guide, the concierge, and the law. The quiet is profound, a deep, resonant silence broken only by the sigh of the wind through the colossal Douglas firs, the chuckle of the nearby creek, and the calls of the wild inhabitants. I've always found peace in this solitude. The isolation sharpens your senses, forces you to be self-reliant. It feels like living on the edge of the world, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The season had been proceeding with its usual rhythm. Families and couples came and went, leaving with smiles, photos, and a renewed appreciation for the outdoors. The bears were behaving, the trail washouts were minimal, and the biggest emergency I'd faced in weeks was a 7-year-old with a nasty case of poison oak. It was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect, uneventful stretch. That all changed on a crisp Tuesday in late September. A new family, the Millers, had checked into cabin 7 that afternoon. There was David, the father, a friendly man with an easy laugh, his wife, Sarah, who seemed a bit more reserved, more of a city person, and their 2 young kids, Leo and Mia, who immediately exploded out of the car and began chasing each other around the clearing with shrieks of delight. I went through my standard orientation with them. Bear, proof your trash. Don't leave food out. Here's the map of the approved trails. The creek is faster than it looks. Enjoy your stay. They seemed like a lovely family, excited for a few days of quality time away from the noise of their lives. David, an avid photographer, was particularly keen to explore. He asked about the best spots for scenic shots, and I pointed him toward a lesser-known overlook about a mile up a trail that branched off from the main loop. They settled in, and the afternoon faded into a peaceful, golden evening. I was in my small ranger cabin, finishing up some paperwork, when a frantic, percussive knock rattled my door. It wasn't the polite rap of a visitor with a question. This was an urgent, desperate sound. I opened the door to find David Miller standing on my porch, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror I had only ever seen on the faces of people who had stared over a cliff edge or come face to face with a startled grizzly. "Ranger Hawthorne," he gasped, his voice tight and breathless. I need to report something. Something's happening in the woods." I immediately switched into professional mode. "Okay, Mr. Miller, slow down. What did you see?" "An animal." He shook his head, running a trembling hand through his hair. "No, not an animal, people, but they weren't normal." I guided him inside and got him a glass of water. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady, the way they train you to. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I went for a walk. To that overlook you mentioned. The light was perfect. Just as you said it would be. On my way back, I heard something. Chanting. It was low, guttural. It sounded wrong. So I stepped off the trail just a little ways. I thought maybe it was some kids messing around." He paused, swallowing hard. I pushed through some ferns and looked down into a small, hidden clearing. There were figures. Maybe 5 or 6 of them. They were all wearing these heavy, dark hooded robes. I couldn't see their faces, just shadows where a face should be. They were standing in a circle, and in the center, there was something on the ground. I couldn't make it out. They were chanting in a language I've never heard before. It made the hair on my arms stand up. It felt ancient and evil. My internal alarm bells were starting to ring, but my training kept my expression neutral. Pranksters. Local kids trying to scare tourists. It was a possibility. What happened then? I prompted. They just stopped. He said, his voice barely a whisper. All at once, the chanting stopped. The silence was worse. They stood there for a long time, completely still. And then, one by one, they turned and just melted back into the forest in different directions. It was the most unsettling thing I've ever seen. They moved so quietly. I nodded, processing the information. Did they see you, Mr. Miller? I don't think so. I pray to God they didn't. After they were gone, I waited. For a long time, I was too scared to move. Finally, I crept down into the clearing to see what they were doing. His eyes met mine, and the fear in them was raw and absolute. Ranger, they'd carved symbols into the trees. Big, ugly things. And on the ground, where the thing I couldn't see was, it was a dead fox. And the symbols were drawn around it, in its blood. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was no longer a teenage prank. This was something else entirely. What did the symbols look like? I asked, pulling out a notepad. He squeezed his eyes shut. Trying to remember, like a spiral, but with sharp, jagged edges like it was made of thorns. And another one, it was a triangle with an eye in the middle, but the eye was crying a single, long tear that turned into a serpent at the bottom. The description sent a genuine chill down my spine. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever encountered in any field guide or historical park document. It sounded like something conjured from a nightmare. This was a desecration, a violation of the sanctity of the park. More than that, it was a clear and present human threat, something far more unpredictable and dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. I ran, David confessed, shamefaced. I didn't even think to take a picture. I just turned and ran all the way back here. My wife, the kids, are they safe out here? You're safe, I said, hoping I sounded more convinced than I felt. Your cabin is secure. I'm going to go check this out right now. Can you show me on the map exactly where you were? He shakily traced the route with his finger, his hand leaving a sweaty smudge on the paper. The location was deep, off-trail, in a section of woods that was thick and notoriously easy to get lost in. Okay, I said, standing up and grabbing the keys to my patrol truck. Stay with your family. Lock your doors. I'll be in radio contact if I find anything. It was a partial lie. The radio was spotty at best in that area, but it was what he needed to hear. As David Miller hurried back to the relative safety of his cabin, I stood for a moment in the doorway of my own. The sun had dipped below the ridge, and long, purple shadows were stretching across the valley. The familiar, peaceful forest suddenly felt different. It felt watchful. The wind rustling through the pines no longer sounded like a sigh, but like a whisper, carrying secrets I was not meant to know. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, my service sidearm, and a backup radio. With a deep breath, I locked my own door and headed toward the darkening tree line, toward the place where the hooded figures had left their bloody, terrifying message. The quiet of the woods was waiting. The beam of my flashlight cut a nervous, bouncing path through the encroaching darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under my boots sounded unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. As a ranger, I've walked these woods at night 1,000 times, comfortable in the knowledge that I was the most dangerous thing out here. Tonight, that confidence was gone, replaced by a primal alertness I hadn't felt in years. The forest was no longer my sanctuary. It was a hunting ground, and I was walking willingly into a predator's den. I followed the trail to the overlook David Miller had mentioned, then located the game trail he'd used as a landmark. Pushing past a curtain of damp, fragrant ferns, I found it. The clearing was small, almost perfectly circular, cupped in a hollow, and surrounded by a silent council of ancient cedar trees. The air here was heavy and cold, carrying a coppery tang that my senses immediately identified as blood. My light swept across the scene, and I had to physically restrain myself from taking a step back. David's description hadn't done it justice. It was a scene of methodical desecration. In the center of the clearing lay the fox. Its body was arranged with a grotesque, ritualistic precision, its limbs splayed unnaturally. Around it, drawn in the same dark blood, was the weeping eye triangle. The symbol pulsed in the harsh glare of my flashlight, looking less like a drawing and more like a wound in the earth itself. My gaze lifted to the surrounding trees. Carved into the bark of 3 of them was the other symbol, the vicious, thorny spiral. The cuts were deep and fresh, weeping sap that glistened like tears in the light. This was not the work of kids with a pocket knife. The lines were too precise, too deliberate. They'd been carved with intent and skill. I knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, my training kicking in and pushing the fear down. Document. Observe. Analyze. I took out my camera and began taking photos from every angle, the clinical flash of the camera a small rebellion against the oppressive, arcane atmosphere. The ground was disturbed, covered in a mess of overlapping footprints from what looked like soft, soled shoes or moccasins. No clear impressions. They'd been careful. As I photographed the last of the carved trees, my light caught something on the ground near the base of the trunk. It was a small, dark object. I carefully picked it up using my gloved fingers. It was a single raven feather, tied with a thin strip of red leather to a small, sharpened piece of bone. It was clearly a man-made fetish of some kind. David hadn't mentioned this. Had he missed it in his panic, or had it been left after he fled? The thought that one of them might have returned sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. I straightened up, pocketing the fetish in an evidence bag, and swept my light around the perimeter of the clearing one more time. That's when I felt it. The unmistakable, prickling sensation of being watched. It's an instinct you can't teach, an animal sense of unseen eyes fixed upon you. The forest, which had been filled with small night sounds, had gone completely, unnaturally silent. No crickets. No rustling of small animals. Nothing. Just the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. Slowly, deliberately, I unholstered my sidearm, holding it in a low, ready position. My flashlight beam cut through the trees, probing the deep pools of shadow beyond the clearing. U.S. Park Ranger, I called out, my voice sounding thin and foreign in the profound quiet. Identify yourself. Only silence answered. But then I saw it. A flicker of movement, far back in the trees, maybe 50 yards away. It was a shape darker than the shadows around it, tall and unnaturally thin. It was there for only a second, a brief silhouette against the moon-dappled foliage, before it seemed to dissolve back into the darkness. It hadn't made a sound. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were still here. They were watching me. There was nothing more I could accomplish here, not alone. My priority now was to get back, report this, and ensure the safety of the visitors. I began to back away from the clearing, moving slowly and deliberately, my weapon still drawn, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth in a frantic arc. I didn't turn my back on the woods until I was back on the main trail. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of silent figures moving parallel to me, just out of sight, their hooded faces turned in my direction. The 1-mile walk back to my truck felt like 100. Once inside the locked cab of the vehicle, I took a deep, shaky breath and grabbed the radio handset. I drove a few hundred yards up to a rise where I knew the signal was strongest. Whisperwind 1 to Blackwood Base. Over. Static crackled in response. Go for base. Whisperwind. You're faint. Over. It was the voice of Chief Ranger Thompson, a man I respected, a 30-year veteran of the service who had seen it all. Or so I thought. Chief, I've got a situation out at the Whisperwind cabins, I said, trying to keep my voice even. I'm at a potential crime scene. We have evidence of unauthorized activity, possible poaching, and ritualistic defacement of park property. I relayed David Miller's story and my own findings, describing the symbols, the dead fox, the fetish I'd found. I made sure to mention the figure I'd seen in the woods. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with the hiss of static. When Thompson finally replied, his tone was weary. Ritualistic activity, Wren. You sure it wasn't some local high school kids trying to be edgy? We get a group of goths from Pine Ridge every couple of years who think it's fun to spook the tourists. Negative, Chief, I said, my grip tightening on the handset. The carvings are precise, professional, and the scene, it's not a prank. It feels dangerous. I think we need to consider closing the Whisperwind district until we can get a full team out here to sweep the area. Close the district. Wren, you know the paperwork that would involve. We can't just shut down a whole sector of the park based on a dead fox and some weird carvings. Look, document everything, take photos, collect what you can. I'll send a patrol out to your location first thing in the morning. For now, just keep an eye on things. Reassure the visitors. Do your rounds and lay low. Don't go looking for trouble. Over. Chief, I think trouble is already here. I insisted. Just be smart, Hawthorne. Thompson out. The radio went dead, leaving only static. I sat there in the dark truck, feeling utterly, completely alone. He didn't believe me. Not really. To him, sitting in his brightly lit office 5 minutes away, it was just another strange report. Out here, in the oppressive darkness, there was a tangible threat breathing down my neck. Defeated, I drove back to the cabin cluster. The warm, yellow lights glowing in the windows of the occupied cabins looked like tiny, fragile islands of safety in an ocean of encroaching darkness. I did a slow patrol around the loop, my headlights cutting through the night. Everything seemed quiet, too quiet. I stopped by cabin 7. The lights were on, and I could see the family's silhouettes moving inside. I considered knocking, telling them what I'd found, but Thompson's words echoed in my head. Reassure the visitors. Causing a panic wouldn't help. I decided to wait until morning. I parked in front of my own cabin and killed the engine. As I sat there, gathering my thoughts, a movement caught my eye. A small figure on the porch of the Miller's cabin. It was the little girl, Mia, standing there in her pajamas, looking out into the darkness. Just as I was about to get out of my truck and gently shoo her back inside, the porch light flickered on. Her mother, Sarah, slid the glass door open. Mia, honey, what are you doing out here? Come on back inside, it's cold. The little girl didn't turn. She just pointed a small finger toward the dense wall of trees at the edge of the clearing. Her small, clear voice carried across the silent night air, chilling me more than anything I had seen in the woods. Mommy, she said, her voice devoid of fear, full of childish curiosity. Who was the tall, skinny man waving at us? The little girl's words cut through the night air like shards of glass. I froze, my heart suddenly a frantic drum against my ribs, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The tall, thin man. It was the exact phrase I'd used to describe the figure I'd seen in the woods, and now he was waving to a little girl from the edge of the dark forest. Instinct took over. I threw the truck door open, drawing my sidearm in the same fluid motion. Sirrah, get your daughter inside and lock the door now. I yelled, my voice raw with an urgency she couldn't possibly mistake. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of me, weapon drawn, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Mia's arm, pulling the protesting child back inside the cabin. The glass door slid shut with a bang, and I heard the click of the lock. I turned back to the tree line, sweeping the darkness with my truck's high beams. There was nothing there, just the swaying shadows of trees and brush. No tall, thin man, no one waving, just the silent, watching woods. I knew he was there. I could feel it. I moved slowly toward the Miller's cabin, my gun still trained on the darkness.
The Millers!
I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Stay in your cabin. Do not come out for any reason. I'm calling for backup. Another lie. Thompson wasn't sending anyone until morning, and my radio was useless from here. I was on my own. As I reached their porch, a new sound started from the other side of the clearing. A soft, scraping sound, followed by the same low, chilling chant David had described. It was coming from the direction of one of the empty cabins. Cabin 4. My heart hammered. I keyed the radio on my hip. Whisperwind 1 to Blackwood Base. I whispered desperately. I need immediate assistance at the Whisperwind cabins. I have multiple hostiles. Repeat, multiple hostiles. They are threatening visitors. Only static answered. I had no choice. I had to handle this. I had to protect that family. I moved through the shadows, skirting the edge of the clearing, making my way toward cabin 4. My gun felt heavy and cold in my hand. The chanting grew louder, a low, rhythmic thrum like a malevolent heartbeat. As I neared the cabin, I saw a faint light flickering in the window. Not the warm glow of electricity, but the wavering light of candles or a torch. I crept to the edge of the window and peered inside. What I saw turned my blood to ice. Inside the bare cabin, 5 dark, robed figures stood around a plain wooden table. On the table, a map of the park was spread out, and they were placing small, carved objects onto it. Fetishes like the one I'd found in the woods. I saw raven feathers, pieces of bone, and polished stones. One of the figures held a long staff topped with the hideous, thorny spiral symbol. The one holding the staff was noticeably taller and thinner than the others, even under the robe. I knew this was him. The tall, thin man. They weren't chanting anymore, but speaking in a hushed, sibilant language that sounded as ancient and dry as rustling leaves. Their faces were obscured by the shadows of their hoods. But then the tall one turned his head slightly, and the candlelight caught his face for a brief second. It wasn't a face at all. It was a mask of pale wood, carved into a serene, emotionless visage. The eyes were just dark, empty holes. He suddenly stopped talking and looked up, staring directly at the window where I hid. It was as if he'd known I was there the whole time. "Guardian," he said, his voice a dry, rasping sound that was impossibly loud. His English was perfect, but carried a strange, unidentifiable accent. "Have you come to join the rite, or to interrupt it?" The other figures turned in unison, their hooded heads swiveling toward me like owls. I pulled back from the window, raising my gun. "U.S. Park Ranger! Come out with your hands up!" I shouted, the practiced words sounding absurd in the face of this kind of horror. A low chuckle came from inside the cabin. "This park is not yours," the rasping voice said. "It belongs to something far older. We are merely the stewards of its will, and tonight its will is to harvest." The door of cabin 4 swung open slowly with a low groan. The tall, thin man stepped out, the moonlight glinting off his pale, wooden mask, making it seem impossibly sinister. In one hand, he held the thorny staff, in the other, a long, curved knife whose blade shone with a cold, lunar light. The 4 other robed figures filed out behind him, flanking him like a grotesque honor guard. With Sikh harmony, the masked man said, taking a slow step toward me, "A small sacrifice for the greater balance. Your visitors, the family, they will serve the purpose well. Their spirits will enrich this soil."
Stay back.
I yelled, my voice trembling. "One more step and I'll shoot." The leader chuckled again. "Your weapons have no power here. Our faith is our shield. And death is a door, not an end." He took another step, and I did what I was trained to do. I fired twice in rapid succession, the gunshots echoing like cannon fire in the silent valley. I aimed for center mass, the largest target. I saw the rounds impact his dark robe, but he didn't even flinch. He didn't stumble or cry out in pain. He simply looked down at the 2 small, torn holes in his robe, and then back up at me. "You see," he whispered, meaningless. Panic flared hot in my chest. They kept advancing on me, slow and relentless, like a dark tide. I fired again, this time at the robed figure on the far left. He went down, but without a sound, just a soft thud as his body hit the dirt. The others kept coming, not even glancing at their fallen companion. I knew I couldn't fight them all. I had to get to the Millers. I turned and ran for cabin 7, shouting for them to get ready. "They're coming! Hide!" I could hear their unnaturally quiet footsteps behind me. They were faster than they looked. I reached the porch of cabin 7 and pounded on the door. "Open up? Quick!" David opened the door, his face a mask of terror. "What's going on?" "No time?" I shoved him back inside and locked the door behind me. "Get in the back room." "Stay away from the windows." I turned back to the door just as the shadow of the tall, thin man fell across the glass window. His wooden mask was pressed against the pane, its empty eyes seeming to peer into my soul. He didn't try to break the door down. He just stood there watching. Then he raised a hand and tapped lightly on the glass with a gloved fingertip. A polite, chilling knock. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the silent cabin. It was the sound of a patient death. I raised my gun again, aiming at the mask through the glass, but before I could pull the trigger, a scream came from behind me. I spun around. Sarah was standing in the hallway, her face white with terror. She was staring at the back window of the cabin, the one that looked out into the dense woods. 3 robed figures were standing there, staring in. They had us surrounded. The leader at the front door knocked again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was louder now, heavier, like the beat of a ritual drum. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl, the splintering of wood from the back of the cabin. They were breaking in. I was trapped between two impossible choices: the monster at the front door and the monsters breaking in the back. The Miller family was sobbing behind me, and in that moment, amidst the chaos and fear, a horrible realization dawned on me. Thompson hadn't disbelieved me, he had dismissed me. He might have known about this all along. A dark, hidden secret of the park, a terrible bargain struck to keep the peace. Let a small cult have their grisly rituals in the most remote part of the park in exchange from not causing trouble elsewhere. A loud crash of wood and glass exploded from the back, and one of the robed figures tumbled through the shattered window frame. I fired, but another was right behind him. The leader at the front door smashed the glass and stepped into the cabin. His wooden mask turned to me, its empty eyes seeming to fill with an ancient triumph. I knew I was going to die here, in this cabin full of screams. And the last secret I would carry with me was the sound of the tall, thin man's patient knock. My name is Ellery Vance, and for the past 6 years, my official title has been Field Logistics and Safety Coordinator for the North Pacific Research Institute. It's a formal, slightly cumbersome title that boils down to a simple, critical function. I'm the person who makes sure scientists can do their work in some of the most beautiful and unforgiving places on Earth without getting themselves killed. I handle everything from supply chain management and sub-zero temperatures to aware protocols and emergency medevac coordination. I am, in essence, a professional caretaker, a planner of contingencies, a student of everything that can go wrong. My job is to respect the wilderness, not to fear it. But the wilderness doesn't always respect you back. This particular expedition had brought us to the icy, cathedral-like splendor of Glacier Bay National Park, Alaska. Our base of operations was a chartered research vessel, the Stellar, a sturdy, no-frills boat that served as our floating lab and home. The mission, led by the brilliant but notoriously single-minded glaciologist Dr. Aris Thorne, was to study the rapid retreat of the Grand Pacific and Marjorie glaciers. We were a small, specialized team. Besides Aris, there was Dr. Lena Petrova, a marine biologist studying the new ecosystems emerging in the wake of the melting ice, and a documentary film crew, Mark and Sarah Hayes, tasked with capturing the stark reality of climate change. And then there was their son, Leo. Leo was 7 years old, a bright, curious kid with a mop of blonde hair and eyes the color of the deep, blue ice caves we sometimes passed. Bringing a child on an expedition of this nature was highly unorthodox, a breach of a dozen unwritten rules and a couple of written ones. But Mark and Sarah were a package deal, the best in their field, and their contract had been negotiated with a fierce, parental insistence. They argued that exposing their son to the raw, untamed world was the greatest education he could receive. Aris, impatient with anything that distracted from his data, had reluctantly agreed. It fell to me naturally to be Leo's unofficial, and often official, guardian. My list of contingencies grew a new, very unpredictable variable. For the first 2 weeks, things were idyllic, lulling us into a false sense of routine. Days were spent on the water in smaller skiffs, taking measurements, collecting samples, and filming the thunderous spectacle of glaciers calving. The air was pure and sharp, the silence broken only by the cry of gulls, the bark of sea lions on distant rocks, and the constant, groaning sigh of the ice. The landscape was a paradox, a portrait of serene, static beauty that was, in reality, in a state of constant, violent flux. Mountains of ice, centuries old, would shear off and crash into the bay with a sound that shook you to your bones, a visceral reminder of the power we were here to observe. It was during one of these long days that the first thread of unease began to unravel. We had a local Tlingit man from Bartlett Cove, named Silas, serving as our guide and cultural liaison. He was a quiet, weathered man whose knowledge of the bay was as deep as the fjords themselves. One afternoon, as Leo was sketching the face of the Marjorie Glacier in a notepad, Silas watched him from the stern of the skiff. His expression was tight, his gaze fixed not on the boy, but on the dark, impossibly cold water that lapped against the ice floes near our boat. We shouldn't be so close to the edge. Silas said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the still air. Sarah, standing beside Leo, gave a reassuring smile. "He's fine, Silas. We're right here with him." Silas didn't smile back. He looked at Sarah, then at Mark, then at me. "It's not about watching him. It's about what watches from the water. Old stories. The grandmothers used to tell them to keep children from the shore." He paused, his gaze returning to the turquoise water. "They say there's a humming sound, a song, just for the little ones. They say you don't hear it until it's too late." Eris, who was busy calibrating a submersible drone, scoffed without looking up. "Folklore. Fascinating, but not exactly empirical data, Silas. The most dangerous things in this water are hypothermia and floating ice." Silas said nothing more, but he spent the rest of the day staying physically close to Leo, a silent, vigilant shadow. The word he'd used, which I later looked up in one of the regional books I kept on the Stellar, was kalupalik. The book described it as a myth, a creature from Inuit and Yupik lore, not strictly Tlingit, but the stories often bled across cultures in the far north. It was described as a humanoid creature, often female, with long, wild hair and greenish, clammy skin that lived beneath the ice. It was said to hum or sing to lure children to the water's edge. When they were close enough, it would snatch them, tucking them into the large hood of its amadiat, an Inuit parka, and carrying them away to its cold, dark home. A boogeyman designed to terrify children into behaving. I dismissed it just as Eris had. My job was to worry about measurable threats, sudden storms, equipment failure, aggressive wildlife. Ancient myths were not on my checklist. Still, Silas's solemnity had planted a seed of discomfort. The vast, empty wilderness suddenly felt a little less empty. The day it happened started like any other. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The team was working on a series of ice floes a few miles from the face of the Grand Pacific. Eris and Lena were taking core samples, drilling deep into the floating ice. Mark and Sarah were filming, capturing the intricate patterns and the almost luminescent quality of the compressed, ancient ice. Leo, bundled in a bright red snowsuit that made him easy to spot, was building a small fort out of chunks of ice, a safe distance from the edge. I was ferrying equipment between the skiff and the main flow, my eyes constantly scanning the area, a habit ingrained by years of practice. The distraction, when it came, was immense and impossible to ignore. Without warning, a section of the Grand Pacific the size of a city block fractured and gave way. The sound was not a crack but a deafening, apocalyptic roar that ripped through the silence. It was 1,000 claps of thunder at once. Every one of us instinctively froze and turned to watch. The spectacle was terrifying and magnificent. The mountain of ice seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before collapsing into the bay, sending a colossal wave surging outwards. Even miles away, our flow rocked violently. It was a full minute before the final echoes died away and the water began to calm. Awed and shaken, we turned back to our work, our ears ringing. It was Lena who spoke first, her voice strained. "Where's Leo?" My head whipped around. The red snowsuit, the one beacon of color I'd been tracking all morning, was gone. His small ice fort was there, but the boy was not. Panic, cold and sharp as the water itself, seized us. "Leo!" Sarah's voice was a raw scream that was swallowed by the immense space around us. We fanned out, our calls growing more frantic. The ice floe was large, but not that large. There were no crevasses he could have fallen into, no ridges to hide behind. Mark scrambled to the edge, his face white with terror, scanning the dark water, littered with smaller pieces of ice from the calving. "He was just here!" Sarah was sobbing now, her hands scanning the empty spot where he'd been playing. He was right here. My mind raced through the protocols. Man overboard, hypothermia. The survival window in water this cold was measured in minutes. I was already keying the radio on my jacket, calling back to the Stellar for emergency prep, when Eris shouted, his voice sharp with disbelief. "There! Over there!" He was pointing towards a smaller, isolated floe about 50 yards away, one that had likely broken off from ours during the surge from the glacier. And on it, a small, still figure in a red snowsuit. It was Leo. He was on his knees at the very edge, his back to us, staring down into the water. Relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me, but it was immediately followed by a chilling confusion. How did he get over there? He couldn't have jumped. The surge. Could it have washed him across? It seemed impossible. "Leo! Leo! Stay right there!" I yelled, my voice cracking. Mark was already in the skiff, yanking the cord on the outboard motor. It sputtered to life with a roar that seemed profane in the sudden silence. As the boat sped across the short distance, I watched through my binoculars, my heart pounding. Leo didn't turn. He remained kneeling, perfectly still, as if mesmerized by something I couldn't see. As Mark's skiff drew alongside the floe, he reached out and grabbed his son, pulling him aboard. Only then did Leo seem to wake from his trance. We saw him start to shiver violently, his small body shaking. Even from a distance, I could see the profound, vacant terror on his face as he looked back, not at us, but at the dark water he had been kneeling over. The journey back to the main ice floe was the longest 50 yards of my life. Mark held Leo cradled in his arms, the boy's small body wrapped in an emergency thermal blanket from the skiff's kit. Sarah was already there when the boat nudged against the ice. Her hands reaching for her son before Mark had even fully stabilized the vessel. She pulled Leo into her own frantic embrace, her face buried in the hood of his snowsuit, murmuring his name over and over like a prayer. The rest of us gathered around, a tight circle of fear and relief. My first priority was a physical check. "Is he wet?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "Sarah, I need to know if he went in the water." She pulled back, her hands running over Leo's suit. "I don't think so. It feels dry. Cold, but dry." I knelt, running my own gloved hands over the bright red fabric. She was right. It was bone chillingly cold from the wind and contact with the ice, but he wasn't wet. That fact deepened the mystery and did little to quell the unease coiling in my gut. If the wave from the calving hadn't washed him over there, how in God's name had he crossed the gap? The water that now separated the two floes was at least 20 feet across at its narrowest point. Leo himself was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering in a fast, frantic rhythm. But it wasn't just the cold. His eyes, usually so bright and engaged, were wide and unfocused, staring at some middle distance that none of us could see. He clung to his mother with a strength that was startling in a 7-year-old. "Leo, honey, can you tell us what happened?" Sarah asked, her voice soft and trembling. "Did you fall? How did you get over there?" He just shook his head, pressing his face harder into her shoulder. "Give him a minute," Mark said, his hand resting on his wife's back. He was trying for a calm, authoritative tone, but his own face was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the skiff. It was Eris who broke the fragile quiet, his voice laced with impatience. "He's in shock. The noise, the wave, it must have disoriented him. He probably scrambled over onto that piece of ice when it was still close to ours and didn't realize it had broken away. We've lost nearly an hour of daylight. We need to get him back to the Stellar and get back to work." Work. Sarah snapped, spinning to face him, her eyes blazing. "My son just vanished in plain sight, and you're worried about losing daylight. My concern," Eris said, his tone becoming cold and precise, "is that we are on a multi-million-dollar expedition with a limited window to gather irreplaceable data. The boy is safe. He's had a scare. A rational response is to ensure he is warm and comfortable and then resume our duties." Before the argument could escalate, Silas stepped forward. He had remained silent until now, his dark eyes fixed on Leo. He knelt down slowly, not crowding the boy, but bringing himself to his level. He didn't speak. He simply waited. After a long moment, Leo's shivering subsided slightly. He turned his head, just enough to look at the Tlingit guide. "Did you hear it, Leo?" Silas asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. The humming. Leo's breath hitched. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes filling with fresh tears. "She sang," he whispered, his voice so faint we had to lean in to hear. The singing woman. A collective chill, entirely separate from the Alaskan air, passed through our group. I saw Lena's scientific curiosity warring with a primal fear on her face. Mark looked utterly bewildered. Eris just rolled his eyes in exasperation. Sarah, however, looked directly at Silas, her expression one of dawning horror. What did she sing Leo? Silas continued, his voice steady. My name, Leo breathed. She was under the ice. I could see her hair, like seaweed. She wanted me to come with her. She said she had a warm place for me in her hood. She was pulling me. He gestured with a trembling hand, not towards the other floe, but down towards the dark water at his feet. Her hand was on my leg. It was so cold. The protocol section of my brain was short-circuiting. I was trying to process his words through a filter of logic. Hypothermic hallucination, auditory pareidolia caused by the glacier's roar, a dream state brought on by shock. But the conviction in his tiny voice, the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes, was impossible to dismiss. It felt real. Silas's old story, the Kalupalik, echoed in my mind, no longer a quaint piece of folklore, but a terrifyingly accurate description. We packed up in record time, the argument forgotten, replaced by a tense, oppressive silence. Back on the Stellar, Sarah and Mark took Leo below to their cabin. Lena and I gave him a more thorough check. There were no marks on his leg, no physical evidence of anything he described. His body temperature was low but not dangerously so. We left him wrapped in blankets, sipping hot cocoa, with a portable video player to distract him. Up on the deck, the rest of us convened. The mood was grim. It was a hallucination. Eerie stated not as a theory, but as a fact. The confluence of the loud noise, the violent motion of the ice, and the cold created a temporary psychotic break. It's a documented phenomenon in extreme environments. He's suggestible. He heard Silas's ghost story the other day, and his terrified mind filled in the blanks. His description was incredibly specific, Eris. Lena countered, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. The hair like seaweed. The immediate hood, he couldn't have known those details. He could have overheard more than we realized. Children absorb everything, Eris retorted dismissively. I turned to Silas, who was looking out at the glacier, now bathed in the long, golden light of the afternoon. Silas, what do you think? He took a slow breath, the cold air misting around his lips. I think you do not live in this place for 10 generations and not learn what to believe. The ice has a memory. The water has a hunger. The Kalupalik is not a story to make children behave. It is a story to keep them alive. She is real. She takes children who wander. She takes them when the land is loud, when the ice thunders, so the parents are distracted. She has been waiting. The melting of the icy, it makes the old things restless. His words hung in the air, heavy and solid as chunks of ice. I found myself believing him. Every instinct I had, every contingency plan I'd ever made, was based on the predictable laws of physics and biology. But what do you do when faced with a threat that operates outside those laws? How do you write a protocol for a myth that reaches out of the water and grabs your leg? The expedition was poisoned after that. A curtain of fear and distrust had fallen. Mark and Sarah were constantly by Leo's side, their faces etched with anxiety. Leo rarely spoke. He stopped sketching. He refused to go out on the skiffs, and when he was on the deck of the Stellar, he wouldn't go within 10 feet of the railing. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him crying in his cabin. Eris, furious at the delays and what he called morbid superstition, pushed us harder, demanding longer hours, more data, trying to outrun the fear with work. His relentless pressure only frayed our nerves further. The easy camaraderie we'd shared was gone, replaced by whispered conversations and suspicious glances. The wilderness, which had felt so majestic and inspiring, now felt menacing, watchful. Every shadow on the water, every groan from the glacier, seemed to hold a new, sinister meaning. A few nights later, I was in the ship's small lab, helping Lena analyze some of the underwater audio recordings from a hydrophone she'd placed near the glacier face. It was mostly the crackle and pop of melting ice, the low groans of the glacier, and the occasional clicks of marine life. We were about to pack it in for the night when Lena suddenly held up a hand, her brow furrowed. "Wait," she said, tapping her headphones. "Listen to this." She rerouted the audio to the small cabin speakers. Amidst the cacophony of the ice, there was another sound. It was faint, high-pitched, and rhythmic. It was almost melodic. It was a low, undulating hum. It wasn't a wail, and it didn't match the signature of any known marine mammal. It was a sound that had no business being there. As we listened, the hum seemed to resolve itself into a sequence, a pattern that was almost a tune. It was a haunting, simple melody that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I looked at Lena. Her face was ashen. Then, from the hallway, we heard it, a small, quiet sound. It was Leo, humming in his sleep from the cabin down the hall. He was humming the exact same tune. Lena and I stood frozen in the narrow corridor of the lab, the sound from the speakers and the sound from down the hall merging into a single, terrifying harmony. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. Every rational explanation, every psychological theory that Eris had championed, evaporated in that moment. A hallucination cannot be recorded on a hydrophone. A coincidence cannot carry the same unearthly tune. This was real. Whatever had happened to Leo on the ice floe, it had left a piece of itself with him. A haunting melody that now connected the boy to the cold, dark depths of the bay. I moved first, my feet feeling like lead. I walked slowly down the hallway to the cabin Leo shared with his parents. The door was slightly ajar. Peeking through the gap, I could see him in his small bunk, curled up under a thick quilt, his breathing deep and even. He was fast asleep, but the faint, eerie humming continued to emanate from him, an unconscious and deeply disturbing lullaby. I saw Sarah sitting on the edge of the lower bunk, her back to me, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had heard it too. There was no more denying it, no more hiding behind scientific detachment. We were no longer researchers observing a changing landscape. We were intruders in a place with rules we didn't understand, being stalked by a predator we couldn't comprehend. The next morning, the atmosphere on the Stellar was thick with a fear that was almost tangible. I called a meeting on the deck. Everyone but Leo was there. I laid it out plainly, the recording from the hydrophone, the fact that Leo was humming the identical tune in his sleep. I played the recording for all of them to hear. The faint, melodic humming filled the tense silence, a sound so alien and yet so horribly familiar. Mark went pale, staring at the speakers as if they were venomous snakes. Sarah, who had clearly not slept, wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes haunted. Lena, my fellow witness, stood beside me, her scientific composure shattered, replaced by a raw, naked fear. Eris, predictably, was the first to break the silence. "It's a resonance," he said, but his voice lacked its usual cutting conviction. "The ship's engine, the glacier's movement, it's creating a low-frequency sound that he's unconsciously mimicking. It's a fascinating acoustic anomaly, nothing more." "Did you hear the stories Silas told Eris?" Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet, about the singing, about what takes children. "Do you think that's an anomaly too?" "I think," Eris snapped back, "that we are allowing folklore to infect a scientific endeavor. We are professionals, not villagers cowering from a local ghost story. My people have been living and dying by these ghost stories for 1,000 years. A calm voice interjected. It was Silas. He stepped into the center of our fractured group. His face was grim, but his eyes were steady. He looked at Eris, then at the rest of us. "You have brought the modern world here, with your machines and your measurements. You listen, but you do not hear. You look, but you do not see. You have disturbed the water. You have recorded her song. Now she believes you have something that belongs to her. She has marked the child. She will not stop. What does that mean?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. "What does she want?" "She wants him back," Silas said simply. "She thinks she has made a trade. He heard her song, and now she is connected to him. She will try to draw him back to the water. The humming will get stronger. He will start to hear her even when he is awake. He will start to walk towards her. The image of Leo, sleepwalking off the deck in the frigid black water, flashed through my mind. It was a primal fear, the kind of safety coordinator could do nothing about. So what do? I asked Silas, my voice barely a whisper. We can't just leave. Leaving might not be enough, he said, his gaze sweeping over our faces. She is patient, but she can be confused, deceived. We must give her a different song to listen to, an offering. We have to show her that the child belongs to us, to the land of the living, not to the water. His plan was rooted in tradition, in a logic that was alien to our own. We were to return to the place where Leo had been found, the isolated ice floe. We had to go at twilight, the time when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest. We were to bring something that represented Leo, something he loved, and offer it to the water. And we had to create our own noise, our own song to drown out her call and break the connection. Eris was apoplectic. This is insane! You want to conduct a seance on an ice floe based on the ramblings of a child and ancient superstition. I forbid it. It's a waste of time and resources. Not to mention, it's dangerous. More dangerous than letting my son be stolen by whatever is in that water. Sarah's voice was filled with a mother's fury. We're doing it, Eris. With or without you. There was no more argument. The decision was made. Mark, Sarah, Silas, and I would go. Lena, looking terrified but resolute, insisted on coming as well to operate the skiff and be our lookout. Eris declared he would have no part in it and stormed off to his lab, muttering about mass hysteria as the sun began to dip towards the jagged peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. We prepared. Sarah emerged from her cabin with Leo's sketch pad, the one he had been using to draw the glaciers. It was filled with his childish, joyful drawings of ice and animals. On the last page was an unfinished sketch of the Marjorie Glacier, the one he was working on the day Silas first warned us. With tears streaming down her face, she handed it to Mark. We took one of the skiffs and headed out. The water was unnervingly still, like black glass, reflecting the dying sky. The air was cold and heavy with anticipation. When we reached the floe, it felt like a cursed place. It was impossible to believe Leo had gotten here on his own. We all stepped onto the ice, which felt disturbingly fragile beneath our feet. Silas walked to the very edge where Leo had knelt. He began to chant in his native Tlingit, a low, rhythmic sound that was both a prayer and a command. He instructed us to make noise. Lena began to methodically bang an emergency oar against the side of the skiff, creating a dull, steady rhythm. I took out my signal horn and began to blast it in short, sharp bursts. Mark stood beside Sarah, holding the sketchbook. "Do it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. With a pained expression, Mark knelt down and placed the sketchbook in the water. It floated for a moment, the pages ruffling in the slight breeze, a vibrant collection of a child's imagination on the verge of being swallowed by the darkness. Then it began, a low hum rising from the water around us. It was the same melody from the hydrophone, but it was no longer faint. It was loud, resonant, and full of a longing that was terrifying. It vibrated through the soles of our boots, a physical presence in the water. The sketchbook, caught in some unseen current, began to slowly drift away from the flow, and then, with a gentle swirl, was pulled under. Suddenly, a shape broke the surface. It was not a head, but a pale, webbed hand, long and slender, with fingers that seemed to trail in the water like tendrils of kelp. It reached for the spot where the book had been, then seemed to clench into a fist of frustration before sinking back into the depths. And then we saw her. Just for a second. Beneath the surface, a face turned towards us. It was pale green with wide, black eyes that held no light, and a mass of dark, swirling hair that framed it like a grotesque halo. It was a face of ancient hunger and eternal cold. A scream tore from Sarah's throat. The sound of our noise-making intensified, becoming a frantic, desperate cacophony against the creature's song. Then, from behind us, came a new sound, a high-pitched electronic squeal. I spun around. It was Eris. He had followed us in the second skiff and was now standing on the far side of our floe, pointing a sophisticated-looking hydrophone rig into the water. A greedy, triumphant look was on his face. He wasn't scared, he was ecstatic. He was capturing the ultimate data. Eris. No, I screamed. But it was too late. The creature's song, which had been a generalized hum, suddenly focused, sharpening into an almost unbearable pitch directed right at Eris's skiff. The water around his boat began to churn violently. "The sound is overloading my equipment!" he yelled, a flicker of panic finally entering his eyes as he fumbled with his gear. Silas grabbed my arm.
"We have to go."
Now, the offering is made. The song is broken, but she is angry. We scrambled back into our skiff, Lena gunning the engine to life. As we pulled away, I looked back. Eris was still struggling with his equipment. The water around him was boiling. The pale, webbed hand erupted from the surface again, this time right next to his boat. It was followed by another. They grabbed the side of his skiff, the material groaning under the pressure. Eris finally looked up from his machines, his face a mask of pure, scientific horror as he stared at the thing pulling his boat down. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The last I saw of him was his wide, terrified eyes, reflecting the last light of the setting sun, before his skiff, his expensive equipment, and Dr. Eris Thorne himself were violently pulled under the surface of the black water, leaving behind only a swirl of icy bubbles. We never saw him again. The expedition was officially canceled the next day, citing a tragic accident. We were debriefed. Reports were filed, and a search that we all knew was futile was eventually called off. Leo never hummed the tune again. He started sketching, but he never drew the color blue. I left the Institute not long after. My job was to plan for every contingency, but my checklists had no entry for ancient hunger and songs from beneath the ice. I still believe in science, in data, in the rational world. But I also know that the world is far older and stranger than our science can comprehend. Sometimes, when the night is very quiet, I think I can hear a faint humming on the edge of hearing, and I know that in the cold, dark places of the world, there are things that wait, and they are waking up.